Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing into the world behind velvet curtains, where royal secrets lounge on satin sheets, and nothing is quite as private as you'd think. Our topic: what sex was really like for queens and mistresses inside royal palaces. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all candlelight and whispered poetry. In fact, you probably won't survive this, not emotionally anyway. These bedrooms had more political landmines than a modern debate stage and more manipulation than a reality dating show finale. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and tell me your city and what time it is where you are, because nothing bonds us like historical gossip right before bed. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So let's start here. You're standing in a royal palace. Let's say France, Versailles, maybe even the 17th century. Everything smells like beeswax polish and perfume laced with ambergris, decay masked with sweetness. You're barefoot on marble floors, your nightgown rustling against your ankles, and just beyond a pair of heavy velvet-draped doors lies the royal bedchamber. But hold on, don't think of it as a bedroom. That would be far too simple. Royal bedrooms were like political theatres with 4 poster stages. Every single object in them meant something. A bed was not just where you slept or got intimate, it was a symbol of dynasty, status and control. Kings received ministers while still under the covers. Queens had to give birth in public with noble witnesses all around. Sex and sleep were deeply political acts, observed, judged and documented like state affairs. Privacy was something you forfeited the moment you wore a crown. Now imagine this. You're the queen, and it's your first night with the king. You've never even been alone with him until now. There's a warm fire flickering, yes, but there's also a courtier hiding behind a curtain, just to verify the consummation. Your sheets are white, not for comfort, but to catch blood, proving you were a virgin. And if there's no blood, well, you better have a good excuse or someone's head will metaphorically or literally roll. And let's not forget the secret passages. Most palaces had them. Narrow hidden doorways that let lovers slip between rooms without being seen. In Versailles, one of Louis XV's mistresses had a hidden corridor leading directly to his bedchamber. Security or scandal avoidance? Probably both. These weren't places where love blossomed freely. Everything was orchestrated, timed, and in some cases, sanctioned by parliament or papal decree. Even the furniture told stories, canopy beds tall enough to house a person underneath, and mattresses stuffed with horsehair, not for comfort, but for durability. Which, considering the activity, makes sense. Here's a quirky bit. In some courts, the bedding ceremony was a public event. Yep, you, the new royal bride, are escorted to bed by your ladies-in-waiting, stripped down and tucked in while the king is paraded in by his own entourage. Everyone bows, claps, maybe even tosses flowers. It's like the worst episode of The Bachelor, except the stakes are real dynastic lines and entire national alliances. And this wasn't just a French thing. The British did it. The Habsburgs loved it. In the Spanish court, they took things further by monitoring the couple's diet, sleep schedule, and even bowel movements to ensure fertility. Romantic, right? But let's zoom out and ask a deeper question. Did these queens and mistresses actually have any power in the bedroom? Historians are still debating that. Some argue that women at court were pawns, married off to produce heirs, dismissed when no longer useful. Others point out that many queens and mistresses leveraged intimacy into political influence. Some even built entire factions around their bedrooms. It really depended on the era, the woman, and whether the king was more into hunting or flirting that week. And while the queens had the titles, the mistresses often had the fun, sort of. Mistresses usually had their own apartments, lavish gifts, and sometimes more emotional connection with the king than the actual wife. But they also had no security. You could be replaced by a younger woman at any moment. And if you got pregnant, that could mean anything from elevated status to immediate exile, depending on the mood of the crown. Back in the bedroom, the lighting was all candles, flattering and moody, but also hot, smoky, and occasionally the cause of horrific fires. Linens were changed once a week maybe, and bathing, rare. You can imagine what that meant. Perfumes were everywhere, trying to cover what water and soap often didn't. Musk, rosewater and lavender weren't just about smelling good. They were survival tools in the war against stench. One scholarly debate that still lingers is whether royal sex lives were genuinely romantic or just transactional. Some records suggest affection, love letters, passionate nicknames, even a few tearful partings. But others reveal dry records of scheduled visits, fertility charts, and court physicians noting every failed attempt at pregnancy. Was it love? Was it duty? Was it just biology playing royal dress-up? Either way, the truth is this. The royal bed was rarely a place of rest. For queens, it was a stage where their bodies became national assets. For mistresses, it was a high-risk gamble that could lead to luxury or ruin. And for the king, it was often the only place he had control in a world of swirling diplomacy, war, and politics. So tonight, as you tuck yourself under your very own, hopefully unsupervised blankets, just remember, those palatial walls might have looked golden, but behind them, sex was rarely simple, never private, and always strategic. Let's stay right where we are, hovering just outside that lavish bedchamber, but now you're no longer a queen. Nope, you're about to be one. The crown's not on your head yet, but the pressure already is. You've been shipped across a continent, maybe from Austria to France, or Spain to England, in a gilded carriage that smells like dried roses and dust. You've memorised the political alliances, learned a foreign language, had your wardrobe dictated by a dozen diplomats, and now, here comes the weirdest part, the virginity test. Yes, this was real. In multiple royal courts across Europe, queens-to-be were subjected to bizarre and frankly horrifying rituals designed to prove they were intact. What did that even mean? Well, to men in wigs and robes with scrolls of bloodlines and succession plans, it meant your hymen was untouched, your honour unblemished, and your fertility unspoiled. To you, it meant being physically examined by a panel of matronly strangers, or worse, male physicians, all while trying to preserve a shred of dignity. Imagine that. You're 16, 17 maybe, standing in a freezing stone chamber with a fire crackling behind you that does nothing to warm the air. A dowager duchess lifts your skirt like she's checking a bolt of silk. Someone else pokes you with a gloved finger, nods solemnly, and scribbles something onto parchment. Congratulations, you passed the first test of queenship. Your body is ready for consumption. It gets even stranger. In some cases, there were official reports written about this, circulated to both courts. Diplomats sent updates. The Archduchess was found to be in good health, untouched, and capable of bearing children. Like a horse being shipped to stud, these reports weren't private either. Everyone at court talked. They speculated, gossiped, rolled their eyes, or whispered with horror, depending on their loyalties. There's one famously awkward example, Marie Antoinette. Before she even met Louis XVI, the entire French court was buzzing with speculation about whether she was pure enough to marry a future king. And afterward, people tracked her wedding night like it was the Super Bowl. Everyone was waiting for the news of the consummation. It didn't happen for weeks or months, depending on who you ask. Royal failure in the sheets became international news. And let's be honest, these tests were less about virginity and more about control. The crown needed to be sure that any children born from the marriage were legitimate, not because anyone cared about your personal choices, but because royal bloodlines were political currency. A bastard child meant chaos. Wars, succession crises. So you, the future queen, had to be sealed, spotless, and basically preserved like some divine relic from a museum exhibit. Some women faked it, absolutely. There are stories, though often whispered in the margins of history, about queens using tricks like pricking a finger to stain the sheets, or stuffing bits of animal bladder inside themselves to mimic the rupture. Whether those stories are true is up for debate, but the fact that people believe them tells you everything. Even lies could carry a kind of power if they served the narrative. And speaking of lies, there were also tests for fertility. Not medical ones, not really. More like superstitions. Priests prayed over you, midwives read your body like tea leaves, they checked the spacing of your hips, the brightness of your eyes, the warmth of your hands. Yes, seriously. Cold hands? Infertile. Pink cheeks? Promising. It was less science, more medieval Tinder bio. What's truly haunting is how little agency these women had in the process. Your father arranged the marriage, your mother prepped you for it, and then you were sent off with a prayer and a trousseau. The palace you entered wasn't yours, not emotionally, not culturally, and definitely not sexually. You were expected to perform your role perfectly from night one. Smile, curtsy, produce an heir. Oh, and don't enjoy it too much. Modesty was everything. One of the more fringe facts here is the existence of royal wedding manuals. Yes, literal instruction books. Some queens were handed discreet pamphlets explaining the mechanics of sex, often written by monks or noblewomen. These weren't exactly steamy, more like, lie still, endure. God is watching. You weren't supposed to be excited. Turn, you were supposed to be obedient. There's a creepy little tradition that took place in some Scandinavian and German courts, displaying the bloodied wedding sheets the morning after, as proof to the family, the court, sometimes even the public. Imagine that level of intrusion, your most intimate moment turned into courtroom evidence. And if there was no blood, rumours spread. Servants talked, rivals pounced. Scholars still debate whether these rituals served any real function beyond humiliation. Some argue they were just symbolic, designed to appease conservative factions and religious officials. Others think that they were genuinely believed to be protective measures for the crown. Either way, the psychological toll on the queens must have been immense. You weren't starting a marriage. You were walking into a spotlight with the hopes of a nation glaring down at your bedsheets. And here's the darker twist. Sometimes these rituals weren't just about proving virginity, but about breaking you, stripping away your autonomy before you ever entered the marriage. By invading your body, the court reminded you whose you were, not your own, not your husband's, the nation's. So the next time someone sighs dreamily about being treated like royalty, maybe remember this chapter. Behind every coronation and golden crown was a bedroom filled with anxiety, judgment, and the suffocating weight of national expectation. You were born to rule, but first you had to bleed. Now let's switch perspectives again. This time you're not the queen, you're the mistress. Not just any mistress though, you're the chosen one, the king's favourite. You don't have a crown, but you've got something more immediate. Power, flowing through your veins like honeyed wine. The queen may have the legal title and the ceremonial bed, but you have his attention, his letters, his secrets whispered across feather pillows. And for as long as that lasts, you're one of the most dangerous women in the palace. But don't get too comfortable. This is not a safe position. It's a high-wire act with no net. Being a royal mistress isn't about love or pleasure. It's a political strategy, plain and simple. Kings didn't just choose mistresses based on looks or chemistry. They chose them for alliances, for leverage, and often for the way a woman fit into the chessboard of power. A mistress could calm a rival faction, soothe a bruised ego, or deliver exactly the kind of child the legitimate marriage failed to produce. So imagine it. You're in the court of Louis XV, Versailles again. Your name might be Jeanne, but soon everyone will call you Madame de Pompadour. You're poised, witty, unshakably composed. You were born a commoner, but you studied art, literature, and the kind of small talk that disarms dukes and terrifies duchesses. When you catch the king's eye at a masked ball, everything changes. You don't sleep with him right away. That would be vulgar. Instead, you charm him with subtlety, maybe a quote from Voltaire, maybe a poem tucked inside a handkerchief. You know your power isn't just in your body, it's in timing, restraint, and the illusion of availability. Because here's the secret. Being a royal mistress wasn't about sex. It was about politics disguised as intimacy. Once you're installed in your royal apartment, just down the hall from the king, you begin the real work. You entertain him, but you also influence him. Want a position for your brother? Done. Need a rival move to some frozen province far away? Consider it handled. The bedroom is just the opening act. The real performance happens in the quiet moments after, when the king lets his guard down and listens to you. And let's not pretend the queen didn't know, she absolutely did. Sometimes she even approved, tacitly or openly, because it was easier to let the king have a discreet, predictable mistress than risk him chasing tavern girls and scandalising the court. Queens and mistresses often had a strange chilly détente. They avoided each other, or smiled through gritted teeth at court functions. But everyone knew the deal. There were even formal titles for this role. Maîtresse en titre in France, an official mistress position with perks. You got land, a country estate, jewellery, and usually a small army of servants. You were almost royalty, just without the chains of duty, but again, don't mistake this for security. You were always one mood swing away from losing everything. All it took was one new face, one younger smile, one moment of fading interest, and the palace would politely escort you out the back door, your dresses still warm on their hangers. And the gossip? Merciless. You might be adored by the king, but you were hated by half the court. The other women sneered. The clergy condemned you. The poets wrote about you with daggers for pens. Your legacy could flip from muse to monster in a single season, yet some mistresses held on. Some became beloved public figures, advisors, even patrons of the arts. Madame de Pompadour funded Enlightenment thinkers. Barbara Villiers, mistress to Charles II, became a political force and bore several of his children. These women were not just pleasure providers, they were power brokers. Here's a weird little side note. Kings often had more than one mistress at a time, and there were rankings: primary mistress, secondary mistress. Favourite of the moment, it was like a disturbingly organised version of The Bachelor, but with velvet curtains and powdered wigs. And if you were smart, you weren't just sleeping with the king, you were gathering allies, making connections, and ensuring that if you fell from favour, you didn't fall alone. Some women didn't even want to be mistresses, but were pressured into it for the sake of their families. A father might push his daughter toward the king as a form of social climbing. Or worse, a mother might coach her in seduction, as if prepping her for a final exam. Your body became a business card, your smile a negotiation. That tension between personal autonomy and political manoeuvring was the quiet agony behind every smirk at court. Historians still debate how much control these women truly had. Some say they were victims of a patriarchal system used and discarded. Others insist they manipulated the system better than anyone else, turning temporary roles into long-term influence. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. They were women working within limited options, often excelling in environments that wanted them to fail. And let's not romanticize it too much. Being a mistress could be terrifying. If you got pregnant, that could mean everything or nothing. Some kings acknowledged their illegitimate children and elevated the mothers. Others denied it entirely and banished them. There were even cases of forced abortions or hushed-up births. It all depended on the court's mood and your usefulness. What no one tells you about being the king's mistress is how lonely it could be. You're surrounded by wealth, but isolated from real friendship. You sleep in silk, but wake up in fear. You hold the king's gaze, but never his name. Every moment in his arms is a reminder. You are desired, not chosen. You're temporary, no matter how long you last. So tonight, if you dream of court life, of glittering halls and stolen kisses, remember this. In royal palaces, pleasure was rarely free. Behind every whispered promise lay a calculation, and behind every mistress stood a queen, quietly seething or just waiting for the next scandal. By now, you might be thinking that all of this, virginity tests, arranged liaisons, mistress juggling influence and danger, sounds surreal, like it couldn't possibly get more bizarre. But oh, you haven't stepped into the royal bedchamber at peak absurdity yet. Let's walk in, shall we? Welcome to a world where sex wasn't just whispered about, it was watched. Yes, literally. Royal bedchambers weren't always private sanctuaries. Often they doubled as stages for public spectacle, complete with an audience. If you're feeling a little queasy about that, don't worry. So did most of the people involved. Start with the consummation ceremony, the weird little after-party of royal weddings. After all the processions, feasts and awkward dancing, the king and queen would retire to their bed. But not alone. Nope. They'd be accompanied by a trail of courtiers, clergy, high-ranking nobles, maybe even the bride's mother and the king's cousin twice removed. Why? Because the entire court needed proof that the union had been consummated. Proof not of affection or chemistry, but of function. Dynasties depended on it. The bedding ceremony was choreographed like a grim ballet. First the bed was blessed. Then the queen's ladies-in-waiting would undress her, cooing and fussing while pretending they weren't part of something deeply invasive. Meanwhile, the king would be stripped by his own entourage, usually with a fair amount of wine and cringy jokes. Then, drumroll, he'd be escorted to the bed, sometimes accompanied by loud cheering or awkward applause. Once the royal couple was tucked in, yes, tucked in, the curtains might be drawn. But in earlier centuries, people stuck around to watch. Yes, really. This wasn't unique to one country. It happened in Tudor England, Bourbon France, Habsburg Spain, even in Scandinavian courts. Each culture had its own version of how long one should linger before politely leaving the newlyweds to their business. But across the board, it wasn't considered inappropriate. It was considered necessary. Imagine lying there, stiff as a statue, while a cardinal nods approvingly from across the room. Nothing says romance like having your first sexual experience be a group project. Of course, not every royal couple was forced to perform with an audience. Sometimes the witnessing was symbolic. A few people stayed long enough to see the couple in bed, kissed goodnight, and left assuming the rest happened. But still, the pressure was immense, and if the marriage wasn't consummated immediately, oh, the whispers. Ministers might get involved, letters flew between courts, the Pope might be notified. Basically, your bedroom became the world's worst open-door policy. One particularly awkward example, Charles III of England and his wife, Henrietta Maria. The couple was so shy and unaccustomed to each other that it took weeks to finally consummate the marriage. In the meantime, the court lost its collective mind, sending anxious messages to foreign ambassadors. It wasn't just gossip, it was geopolitics. If they couldn't seal the deal, the alliance between their countries could collapse. No pressure, but it wasn't just about wedding nights. In some palaces, beds were arranged so that attendants could stay close during the night, sometimes even sleeping nearby in smaller side rooms or behind partitions. In France, the king's lever and coucher, his waking and bedtime rituals, were public events. Nobles lined up in order of rank to watch him wake up, get dressed, and yes, sometimes even crawl into bed. Not with the queen necessarily, just alone, but with the full ceremonial flair. This meant that if you were a queen or a mistress trying to have a quiet, emotionally normal moment in bed, good luck. Someone was always nearby. Servants were trained to be invisible, but they heard everything. Walls were thin, hallways echoed, and don't forget those ever so convenient secret passageways that let people come and go without being seen. The palace was a fishbowl, and you were the main attraction, even stranger. Sometimes royals encouraged this spectacle. It was a way to prove virility, dominance, and, let's be honest, possessiveness. If a king flaunted his mistress, paraded her through the court, or even let it be known that she had stayed overnight, it wasn't seen as weakness. It was a flex. "Look at me," he might as well have said. "I am so powerful I can rewrite moral codes." Which brings us to one of the more ridiculous fringe facts of this world. Royal beds were often too big for actual intimacy. Some were massive, more decorative than functional, built high off the ground with elaborate steps to climb into them. The goal wasn't comfort, it was display. You might have an entire seating area at the foot of your bed, where courtiers waited while you lounged among the pillows. Sometimes the king or queen would hold audiences from bed. You'd be reclined, dressed but suggestively unbuttoned, giving orders between bites of breakfast. It was theatre, intimate, strange, and totally political. And here's a juicy debate that still stirs among historians. How much of this display was performance versus actual documentation? Did people really stick around to watch the act, or was it all smoke and candles? Some argue that the idea of witnessing sex directly was exaggerated over time, a myth inflated by scandal-hungry chroniclers. Others say, nope, they really did hover in the shadows, ready to confirm the royal deed like a team of glorified notaries. But regardless of how direct the observation was, the fact remains. Sex in the royal world wasn't private. Not really. It was catalogued, analysed and judged like state policy. What happened under the sheets didn't stay there. It travelled through the court in whispers and nods, or it affected treaties, it shaped laws, it started wars. So the next time someone sighs dreamily about living in a castle, remind them the beds were uncomfortable, the rooms were never empty, and if you wanted 5 minutes of privacy with someone you actually liked, you better hope the secret tunnel wasn't already occupied. So you've survived the blood-stained sheets, the awkward parades, the court gossip that travels faster than candlelight down a drafty corridor. What now? You're still in the palace and the king is still watching you, only now with a different kind of interest, one sharpened by strategy and softened by flattery. Whether you're the queen, his official consort, or the mistress tucked discreetly behind an embroidered curtain, one thing is absolutely certain. Seduction at court isn't just an art, it's a career path. And the tools of that trade? Lace, glances, handwritten notes soaked in perfume, and fans more dangerous than daggers. Let's talk about how seduction actually worked in the palaces of Europe. It wasn't like some swoony period drama where a single smouldering glance over a goblet of wine sealed your fate. It was slower, more coded. A game played with rules everyone knew but few dared to write down. Picture this. You're at a royal ball. You're dressed in layers of silk so heavy you can barely breathe. Your face is powdered, your cheeks are rouged, and your eyes peek out just barely from behind a delicately carved mask. The music is playing a low lilting violin, and you're pretending not to look at the man who's been looking at you all evening. Everything is performance. Your movements, carefully choreographed. A drop of the fan means I'm interested. A flick of the wrist? Not tonight. A gloved hand brushing against a sleeve in the right hallway at the right hour. That could start a war, or at least a very complicated love triangle. The language of seduction in the palace was as layered as a diplomatic treaty. But it worked. Oh, did it work? Because desire in the royal court wasn't just about bodies. It was about attention, access, escape. Letters were the currency of emotional seduction. Some kings and noblemen wrote them themselves. Others had secretaries who specialised in the art of lusty poetry. A single note could spark an entire affair, especially if it was sealed with a kiss or scented with lavender, rosewater or even musk, if you were feeling particularly bold. But beware, those same letters could be intercepted. A wrong phrase falling into the wrong hands could lead to exile, scandal, or if you were really unlucky, death by scandalised aunt committee. And perfume, the perfume. It wasn't just for smelling nice, it was for announcing your presence from 3 rooms away. Scents were seductive, sure, but they also masked the very real body odours of an era when people bathed sparingly. Certain mistresses were said to have custom blends made by royal perfumers. Some women wore fragrances that were rumoured to include crushed pearls, animal muscadine, or oils from exotic plants brought back from colonies halfway across the globe. To wear a certain scent was to send a message. I am desirable, I am rare, and I might be the next woman to move into the king's personal chambers. Now here's a fun and slightly ridiculous fringe detail. Some women would deliberately wear uncomfortable shoes. Why? So that when they stumbled at a gathering, a conveniently placed nobleman, often the king himself, could offer his arm. Instant contact, all under the polite umbrella of clumsy innocence. Clutch your pearls, but don't trip too hard. It's all part of the show. And let's not forget the theatre of modesty. True seduction in the palace wasn't about being obvious. You didn't flaunt your body, you hinted at it. A slightly undone ribbon, a neckline just low enough to stir questions, a laugh just too long, paired with a lingering glance across a chessboard. It was maddening, it was calculated, and it was effective. For kings bored by power and routine, that kind of subtle play was irresistible. But the stakes? Oh, they were brutal. If the queen caught wind of your flirtation, or if a rival mistress was better at playing coy, you could be destroyed socially overnight. Banished to a distant estate, married off to a noble with bad breath and worse land. There were even cases of mistresses who mysteriously fell ill after such games. Poison was always a tool in the courtly arsenal. Seduction wasn't just thrilling, it was deadly. Of course, some queens played the game too, especially those married to emotionally absent kings. They weren't always innocent victims. Some queens learned to use flirtation as currency, dancing a little too closely with a general, laughing too brightly at a diplomat's joke just to make their husbands jealous, or gain political leverage. If you couldn't be loved, you could at least be missed. One historical figure who mastered this, Anne Boleyn. She didn't give Henry VIII what he wanted right away. She made him wait years, and in the process, to hers, he broke from the Catholic Church, divorced his first wife, and rearranged the monarchy around her. That's seduction weaponized at the highest level. But as we know, it didn't end well. So remember, playing hard to get may win you a crown, but it doesn't guarantee you keep your head. There's still an open debate among historians. Was all this romantic intrigue a form of empowerment for women, or just another trap? On one hand, seduction allowed women to carve out influence in a rigidly male-dominated space. On the other hand, it placed enormous value on their physical appeal and ability to perform emotional labour. Many women became indispensable to kings, only to be discarded when their youth faded or someone shinier walked by. So as you drift to sleep tonight, fan in hand, imagine yourself navigating a royal ball, not with a sword but with a glance. Every whisper, every perfume-drenched letter, every flirtatious smile is a calculated move in a game where checkmate means either becoming the most powerful woman in the palace or vanishing from it entirely. So now you've played the game, you've twirled your fan, caught the king's eye, maybe even secured a secret rendezvous or 3. You've performed the seductive ballet flawlessly, all while keeping one eye on the queen's expression and the other on your nearest political rival. But what happens after? What happens when the candles have burned low, the bedsheets have cooled, and the royal guards are back at their post pretending not to have heard anything. Welcome to the next chapter of palace life, the awkward, hyper-analysed morning after routine. Because once the deed was done, whether in a royal wedding bed or the velvet-draped corner of a mistress's apartment, the real performance began, and trust me, everyone needed to know about it. Let's say you're the new queen. Your wedding night is over. You wake up to find yourself still stiff with nerves, maybe bruised in more ways than one, and completely aware that a maid is going to come in soon to remove the bedding for public inspection. Sound relaxing? Not even close. In some courts, the king would be expected to report on the consummation to his closest advisors. Yes, literally give a rundown. No filters, no euphemisms. Meanwhile, the queen might be called into a private chamber with senior women of the court who would ask how things went with the same tone you'd use to ask about the weather. It wasn't even a question of did you enjoy it, because, spoiler alert, no one cared. The only real concern was it done? Were you likely to conceive? And most importantly, did you behave with the right amount of ladylike obedience? A queen who was too enthusiastic could be seen as unseemly. A queen who seemed unhappy risked whispers about frigidity, rebellion, or worse, failure. Some courts took it further. In parts of Renaissance Italy and Spain, royal couples were expected to keep logs of their sexual activity, written down by their confessor or personal physician. These weren't diaries full of passion, they were medical documents, clinical, brutal. Imagine waking up, wiping sleep from your eyes, and having a priest ask, "And how was your intimacy last night, your majesty?" It's enough to make your skin crawl. Mistresses weren't immune to this scrutiny either. In fact, sometimes their sexual encounters with the king were even more closely watched, especially if the queen had failed to produce an heir. If a mistress was known to have spent the night in the king's chambers, gossip erupted by breakfast. Servants would make notes, nobles would speculate. By lunchtime, your bedroom habits were the latest form of court entertainment. And then there were the physical signs. Women were constantly observed for changes. Glowing skin, missed periods, fatigue. Was she pregnant? Was she just pale from bad wine? Who knew? But you better believe the court physician was making notes in his ledger. In some palaces, these signs were publicly announced. An official proclamation might be made declaring the queen or mistress in hope of issue, which sounds a lot more poetic than it actually was. Translation? You've had sex and now everyone's waiting to see if you'll swell like a royal balloon. But what if nothing happened? What if you tried night after night and still no baby bump? The scrutiny didn't fade. It sharpened. Whispers turned to accusations. Maybe you weren't trying hard enough. Maybe the king wasn't functioning. Maybe, gasp, someone was cursed. It wasn't just disappointing, it was dangerous. In a world where producing heirs was your job, repeated failure to do so made you politically vulnerable. You became expendable. This brings us to one of the stranger quirks of royal bedroom culture. Fertility rituals. If a queen or mistress wasn't getting pregnant quickly enough, all kinds of bizarre remedies were proposed. Sleep with certain herbs under your pillow. Eat specific foods, like boar testicles or powdered antlers. Take special baths blessed by priests. One Spanish queen reportedly drank a tonic made from crushed emeralds. Spoiler alert, it didn't work and she got kidney stones for her trouble. Now, let's zoom out for a moment. Scholars have long debated whether these elaborate post-coital traditions and fertility obsessions were more about control than concern. Was the monarchy really so obsessed with babies? Or were these rituals just another way of policing women's bodies? After all, the king wasn't being asked to record the exact moment of climax. The burden, shockingly, fell squarely on the woman. As always. And it wasn't just the royalty being watched. Servants who helped prepare the bed or saw you in the morning could make or break your reputation. A maid might mention how long the candles burned. A butler might notice you didn't leave your rooms until well past noon. A courtier might say you looked flush or glowing. These observations were collected, exaggerated and weaponized in court politics. Even something as simple as a discarded ribbon or an unfamiliar pair of shoes outside a door could trigger days of speculation. Mistresses sometimes faked visits to appear more important. Queens sometimes faked illnesses to avoid visits entirely. The post-sex world of the palace wasn't a calm afterglow. It was a battlefield of optics, rumours and heavily perfumed morning-after routines. And if you did get pregnant, congratulations, you now became a walking security risk. Everyone wanted to know if it was a boy, whether the king was truly the father, whether the baby would survive. You were monitored more closely than the crown jewels. One bad fall, one cold breath, one missed communion, and the blame would come down like a thunderclap. So no, there was no such thing as the morning after in a royal palace. There was only the morning report. Your intimacy was not a private memory. It was an open file, reviewed by bishops, ministers, and whispering ladies-in-waiting who pretended to be your friends. Love was never just love, it was politics. Passion wasn't passion, it was policy. And as you drift to sleep tonight, maybe whisper a thank you to the universe for letting you have your own bed, your own choices, and your own secrets. Because back then, even the most private moment could become a matter of state before you'd had time to stretch. So now you've made it past the wedding, the bedding, the speculation, and possibly even the first pregnancy. You're a queen, or perhaps a mistress with staying power, and everyone knows your name. Your chambers are lavish, your robes embroidered, and your status reinforced every time a servant curtsies at the sound of your footsteps. But here's the part they don't engrave in gold. When night falls, when all the powdered wigs have been hung on their stands and the royal dogs are snoring in the corner, you're expected to fulfill your other, less glamorous royal role in bed. And no, it's not optional. Let's not sugarcoat this. Being queen wasn't just about grace and diplomacy. It came with deeply uncomfortable expectations when it came to sex. You didn't marry for love, you married for alliance, legitimacy and heirs, which meant your body wasn't really yours anymore. It belonged to the monarchy, to the bloodline, and to your husband, the king, who, if we're being honest, probably wasn't exactly Prince Charming. So let's say it's been 6 months since the wedding. You haven't produced an heir yet. The court is growing restless. You've been subjected to fertility tests that feel more like livestock appraisals. The king's mother is visiting suspiciously often, and suddenly your ladies-in-waiting start hinting that His Majesty is expected tonight. You know what that means. You're back on duty. The king arrives, maybe drunk, maybe bored, maybe irritated about a failed treaty or a lackluster hunt. You're supposed to smile, welcome him, maybe even flirt a little, because God forbid a queen appear cold. And once the guards close the doors and the fire crackles low, you must perform the one royal task that no one will thank you for unless it results in a baby. Now, not every king was cruel. Some were gentle, even kind, but many were emotionally distant or physically rough. Some didn't even like women. Others were too intimidated to touch you properly, without half a bottle of wine. Either way, you had no say. Consent was assumed, and rejection, unthinkable. A queen who said not tonight risked being labelled disobedient, even treasonous. Your duty to your husband wasn't just expected, it was sacred. And let's remember, contraception existed, sort of, but it was rarely used or trusted, especially by royalty. The entire point of the act was procreation. The queen's body was a dynastic factory, and if the machinery wasn't producing results, it was scrutinised with terrifying intensity. There are records of queens being forced to submit to invasive medical exams, their menstrual cycles tracked like military campaigns. One poor woman was advised to eat nothing but hair and almonds. Another was told to sleep with her legs tied up by silk ribbons to keep the seed in place. It's horrifying, but it happened, repeatedly, because the stakes weren't emotional, they were political, and behind every forced bedroom encounter was a parliament full of noblemen waiting for good news. Now imagine the toll that takes. You lie awake afterward, staring at the silk canopy above your bed, wondering if this time was successful. If the court physician will detect some early sign in your pulse or skin, you're not wondering if it was good, or if he loved you, or even if you felt anything. You're wondering if you've done your job. Meanwhile, the king may have already wandered off, perhaps to his mistress, perhaps to the gaming table, perhaps back to his own private chambers to write letters about alliances and war, while you lie there in the dark, treated with the same care and detachment as a prized broodmare. There's a bizarre historical footnote here. Queens were often expected to maintain their dignity even during sex. No moaning, no movement, certainly no initiating. The idea of a queen being too enthusiastic was scandalous. You were supposed to be chaste, passive and cooperative like a velvet-covered statue. And if you cried afterward, well, hopefully your maid was discreet enough to pretend not to notice. Some queens tried to negotiate space. They pleaded for privacy, or in rare cases, managed to delay the king's visits under the guise of illness or prayer. But most just endured, because what choice did they have? Divorce was rarely an option, neither was rebellion. To disobey was to risk exile, annulment, or worse, a lifetime confined to a convent, Your story ending not with a crown but with whispered shame. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Some historians argue that queens had more agency than we give them credit for, that they could influence when and how often the king visited, that they wielded quiet power behind closed doors. Others disagree, insisting that the vast majority of queens were trapped in gilded cages with no real escape. The truth? Probably both. Like everything else in royal life, your experience depended on the mood of the court, the stability of your marriage, and the political value of your womb. Even mistresses, for all their supposed freedom, weren't exempt from this pressure. If they wanted to stay in favour, they had to keep the king interested. That meant always being available, always in the mood, and always a little more exciting than the last woman to warm his bed. One bored monarch famously dismissed a mistress because she had grown tiresome. He replaced her within a week. She ended up married off to a minor noble and never returned to court. So what did intimacy look like in this world? It wasn't candles and love songs. It was duty wrapped in lace. It was ceremonial and scheduled. It was often unreciprocated, sometimes painful and always political. Sex wasn't an act of connection. It was an act of allegiance. As you slip under your own blankets tonight, think about the women who had no such luxury. No ability to say no. No choice about when, how, or with whom. Their titles didn't protect them. Their beauty didn't save them. And their crowns? They just made the bed heavier. You're still in the palace, but now something's changed. Something inside you. Your body feels different. Your sleep is restless. Your appetite strange. Your dresses, once laced tight, now resist at the waist. Then comes the quiet confirmation whispered by your most trusted maid. You've missed your courses. That's You're pregnant. And just like that, your body, already public property, is no longer yours in any way at all. You've become a vessel, a sacred scrutinized container for the most precious item in the entire kingdom, an heir. From the moment that possibility hangs in the air, the mood around you shifts. You're not treated with more tenderness, don't be silly. You're treated with more control. Suddenly everyone is invested in your uterus. Courtiers smile a little more tightly. Midwives begin hovering near your elbow, measuring your colour and pulse. Ministers whisper about bloodlines. The king, who may or may not have actually enjoyed creating this situation, starts appearing at odd hours to ensure you're resting enough. And you? You're walking around like a glass statue, terrified that one false step will ruin, not just your body, but the entire royal succession. Being pregnant in a royal palace wasn't the serene, glowing experience you might imagine. It was more like being placed in a political pressure cooker. Every twitch of your body was a national event. Did the queen eat the fish? Was she nauseous this morning? Did she sleep through vespers? These were not casual observations. They were potential signs. Signs of a boy, signs of fertility, signs of God's favour or disfavour. Superstition ran thick through these corridors, and women paid the price for it. In some cases, the court astrologer would be summoned to cast the horoscope of the unborn child, based on your cravings, or even the hour you first suspected pregnancy. You'd be fed ridiculous advice. Avoid strawberries if you want a boy. Avoid staring at ugly people if you want the baby to be beautiful. Yes, these were actual beliefs. One French noblewoman was told to keep a gold coin under her pillow every night to ensure a safe birth. Another was forbidden from touching anything cold lest it freeze the womb. And the paranoia? Constant. You weren't allowed to ride a horse, dance, laugh too hard, or, God forbid, slip on a marble step. Your food was tasted for poison, your bathwater was checked for temperature, and sometimes for unfavourable omens. Your rooms were padded in tapestries to muffle noise and keep you calm. But calm was a luxury, and you were living in fear. Fear of miscarriage, fear of disappointing the court, fear of delivering a girl when the kingdom was aching for a boy. Because make no mistake, your value hinged on that outcome. If you birthed a male heir, you were exalted, respected, sometimes even loved. If you birthed a girl, a sigh would pass through the court like wind through dry leaves. You'd be patted on the hand and told to rest, then promptly reminded to try again. In private, of course, the king might sulk. The dowager queen might offer a sad smile, and everyone else would nod, disappointed, and start whispering predictions about next time. It didn't help that many royal women had no idea what pregnancy was supposed to feel like. Sex education, if it existed at all, was sure laughable. You were told to lie still and think of duty. You weren't taught what labour pains felt like or what contractions were. Some women thought they were dying when their water broke. Others mistook early contractions for gas or divine punishment. One young queen reportedly tried to confess all her sins when her labour started, convinced that the end was near. Honestly, she wasn't wrong to be scared. And childbirth, let's talk about that. Royal birthing chambers weren't places of peace. They were crowded, hot, and ceremonial. You laboured under heavy sheets, surrounded by an audience of noble women, physicians, midwives, and occasionally clergy, not for support, for documentation. They needed to verify that the birth was real, that the baby was truly yours, that no one had swapped it out with a peasant child behind the curtains, because yes, people genuinely believed that could happen. There's a horrifyingly true story from the court of Louis XIV. When one of his mistresses gave birth, a group of women physically watched the entire process to confirm the child was indeed his, and afterward, the baby was carried directly to a royal advisor before the mother even had time to hold it. That's the level of control we're talking about here. And if the baby didn't survive, your grief wasn't private either. It became part of the public conversation. Whispers about divine punishment resurfaced. Maybe you had sinned. Maybe the king had angered God. Maybe the astrologers were wrong, or worse, maybe a rival had cursed you. The more miscarriages you had, the more dangerous your position became. Some queens were quietly blamed and pushed out. Others were sent away altogether, their broken wombs deemed useless to the realm. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much power a pregnant queen or mistress really had. On one hand, she was revered as the mother of the future monarch. On the other, she was under constant surveillance, stripped of autonomy and discarded if she failed. It's like being crowned while wearing a noose. One wrong move, one weak contraction, and your legacy, your entire value could evaporate in a heartbeat. Even naming the child wasn't your choice. That was often decided by the king, the church, or the court astrologer. You could offer suggestions, sure, but your voice didn't carry nearly as far as the whispers of bishops or the long, scroll-clutching arm of royal tradition. So as you curl up tonight in your decidedly baby-free bed, think about those women, those queens and favourites, who couldn't sneeze without someone taking it as a divine omen, who carried the weight of a kingdom under their ribs, who laboured not just through childbirth, but through fear, pressure, and a suffocating sense of responsibility. Being pregnant wasn't a celebration. It was a test, and the palace was always watching to see if you passed. Let's say you're not the queen. Let's say you're the mistress, beautiful, well-dressed, maybe even beloved by the king. You've navigated the court's icy stares and syrupy smiles, dodged jealous noblewomen and backhanded compliments from your rivals. Maybe you've been clever, discreet, or just lucky. But one day everything tilts. A letter is found. A whisper gets too loud. A chambermaid sees something she shouldn't have. And suddenly the court is buzzing with a far more dangerous rumour. You might have a lover of your own. Here's where the game gets grim, because unlike the king, who could sleep with mistresses, chambermaids, and don probably half the hunting lodge without much more than a stern glance, you, the mistress, had no such leeway. Forget freedom, forget romance. If you were caught cheating, or even suspected of it, the fallout could be brutal. Not just socially, but physically. Public disgrace, imprisonment, forced exile, and if you were a queen, the stakes shot up to lethal. Let's linger for a moment in Tudor England. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, was accused of having an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. The evidence? Letters, testimonies, thin, whispers, and a whole lot of court politics. Catherine was young, likely terrified, and almost certainly groomed by those around her. Didn't matter. She was tried for treason, because in this world infidelity wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a political crime. She was executed at 17. You might wonder, was it really about betrayal, or was it about ownership? Because once you were in the king's bed, he believed he owned every inch of you. Your thoughts, your womb, your loyalty. You were expected to glow for him and him alone, even if he hadn't visited your chambers in weeks. Even if he now favoured someone younger, fresher, or more useful, you were still his. So if you, as the mistress, dared to seek affection elsewhere, whether out of loneliness or rebellion, you were breaking an unspoken contract. And not just with him, but with the entire political machinery that had decided you were in favour. Affairs by mistresses weren't seen as passion. They were seen as betrayal of the monarchy itself. The surveillance didn't end when the king lost interest either. Oh no, that's when things got worse. If you were no longer the favourite, the knives came out. Metaphorically, and occasionally literally. Jealous rivals watched for your missteps, letters were intercepted, footmen were bribed to report your every move, and if you did have a secret lover, God help you. There's a particularly dramatic story from the French court involving a former mistress of Louis XV. After she lost favour, rumours swirled that she'd taken up with a minor nobleman. Not only was she stripped of her title and jewels, but she was sent away to a convent for reflection. Sounds gentle, right? Except this convent had no visitors, no windows, and a vow of silence so intense it bordered on psychological torture. Reflection indeed. It didn't help that even baseless rumours could ruin you. If a jealous rival accused you of impropriety, the burden of proof often fell on you to disprove it. Your letters would be seized, your staff questioned, you might be followed through the gardens, watched at chapel, even interrogated in private chambers by men who couldn't care less about your dignity. And even if you were found innocent, the stain stuck. You were now that one, tainted, unreliable, expendable, and let's not forget how the Queen reacted. If you were a mistress caught cheating, the Queen might pretend to be above it, but inside she was probably revelling, because now, for the first time in a long while, you were on the back foot. A disgraced mistress was a Queen's moment of revenge, even if she had long ago given up on regaining the King's affection. So why did any mistress take that risk? Why fall in love with someone else knowing the danger? Because palace life was lonely. Because kings were often cold, distracted, or cruel. Because a mistress, though powerful, was still human. And being loved, truly loved, by someone who saw you as a person and not a political tool, was a temptation few could resist. There's one especially tragic case that scholars still argue about. Anne, Countess of Castlemaine, mistress to Charles II. She was brash, politically savvy, and knew how to play the court like a violin. But she may have had a lover on the side, possibly even several. Some say the king turned a blind eye, others believe he used it as leverage to keep her in check. Either way, her reputation soured, and although she wasn't exiled, she faded fast from the royal spotlight. Her power, once immense, drained out like spilled wine. Historians still debate whether queens and mistresses ever got away with affairs. Some say yes, quietly, skillfully, with the right protectors. Others insist no, that the risk was too great and the surveillance too relentless. What's agreed upon is this. If you were caught, there was no mercy, no second chance, because for all its satin and sparkle, the palace had no patience for women who broke the rules men wrote for them. Even if your affair wasn't physical, even if it was just letters or shared glances or poetry passed under doors, you could still be ruined. Emotional betrayal was enough, and in a court full of spies disguised as servants, nothing stayed secret for long. So tonight, if your heart is bruised from your own little drama, take a breath and remember this. At least you're not being dragged before a panel of powdered judges for kissing someone behind a hedge maze. The palace was a place where love, if it ever bloomed at all, had to bloom in the shadows, and even then, only briefly, before someone tore it out by the roots. By now you've probably figured out that royal palaces were less about romance, and more about ruthless strategy dressed in silk. And if you were the king's mistress, the real one, not just one of the hopefuls orbiting around, you weren't just slipping into bed at night, you were slipping into a whole new realm of influence. Being in favour wasn't just about what happened under the sheets, it was about what you could get because of it. And believe me, the rewards could be staggering. Let's say the king adores you. He visits nightly, dotes on you in public, and everyone in the palace knows your name, though few say it without a little hiss. You're not just the pretty face beside him anymore. You're getting land, titles, jewels that sparkle like envy itself. Maybe he even gives you a chateau, or 3. But beyond the material stuff, something more potent settles in. Influence. Political, personal and dangerous. At this point, your chambers are the second most powerful place in the palace, right behind the throne room. Ministers wait for you in corridors, nobles flatter you shamelessly, and foreign ambassadors begin sending you gifts just because. They know the truth. If they want the king's ear, they better go through you, or at least pretend to adore your poetry readings. In France, the maîtresse en titre, official chief mistress, was sometimes more powerful than the queen herself. Madame de Pompadour, for example, wasn't just a beauty with a quick wit. She effectively ran domestic policy during parts of Louis XV's reign. She met with diplomats, arranged alliances, and even approved ministerial appointments. Her influence extended so far that nobles began to approach her like a monarch in her own right, and all of it stemmed from one thing: access. But wielding that influence wasn't as easy as sitting pretty. You had to be careful, very careful. Every suggestion had to be wrapped in sweetness. Every opinion served like a delicate dessert. If you were too bold, too obvious, you'd be accused of overstepping. Too quiet, you'd be dismissed as useless. The balance was impossible. Be visible, but not too visible. Be persuasive, but not commanding. Be desired, but not dangerous. Basically, be everything all at once while walking a tightrope over a pit of rivals sharpening their claws. Because the Queen? Oh, she sees you. She can't publicly challenge you, not unless the king lets her, but that doesn't mean she's powerless. She might work through allies at court, or send word to the church, or gently poison your reputation one whispered word at a time. And if you lose the king's favour, the Queen will be the first to watch you fall, with a small, elegant smile. Now, some mistresses used their power for surprisingly noble causes. They championed the arts, funded hospitals, and protected vulnerable friends from exile or execution. Others didn't. They demanded tributes, meddled in court appointments, and crushed their enemies with a fan flick and a fake rumour. One English mistress famously bankrupted an entire noble house just because the lady of the house had the audacity to wear a gown in a similar shade of blue. And then there were the children. If you bore the king a child, especially a boy, your influence could skyrocket. You were no longer just a lover. You were a mother to royal blood. Some illegitimate children were acknowledged and even ennobled. Others were hidden, raised in private estates, or quietly sent away, but even the possibility of producing an heir gave you leverage. It wasn't all glamour, though. The king was fickle, and most were. You could go from queen of the night to exiled ghost in the span of a single season. One day you're being gifted a sapphire the size of a plum, and the next, the locks on your chambers are changed and no one will look you in the eye. New mistresses were always waiting. Younger ones, shrewder ones, or worse, innocent-seeming ones, which was the most dangerous kind. So how did you survive? You built networks, you aligned yourself with powerful ministers, befriended other mistresses if you could, and made sure that every favour you granted came with a string attached. You learned how to speak the court's strange language, half truth, half flattery. You turned down bribes you couldn't afford to accept and accepted ones that came with quiet obligations. You lived in a world where gossip moved faster than light and everyone smiled with teeth. There's a quirky historical tidbit that says a mistress's real power wasn't in how many nights she spent with the king, but how many nights she could refuse him. Rejection, when done with grace, could make a woman even more desirable. One mistress, it's said, once sent the king away with a note explaining she was in prayer. The next day she had 3 new paintings, a necklace, and half the court at her door. Say no, but in a way that makes him desperate to hear yes. And the scholars? Oh, they argue about this endlessly. Was being a royal mistress empowering or exploitative? Some say these women carved out genuine influence in systems designed to silence them. Others insist they were still trapped, just in prettier cages, with better wine. The truth, like most things in history, is probably both. Yes, they gained power, but that power was conditional, fragile, and entirely dependent on a man's whim. Still, it is worth marvelling at the tightrope these women walked. They were courtiers, advisors, seductresses, and politicians, all while wearing stays tight enough to crack ribs. They had no official rank, but commanded armies of favour. They were loved, envied, feared, and despised, and somehow they kept smiling. So tonight, as you slip under your covers, imagine yourself in one of those long, gilded hallways, your gown whispering over polished marble. You've just left the king's side, your hand heavy with jewels, your heart a little heavier with calculation. You know that your power is real but borrowed, and you know the clock is ticking. Because in the royal court you don't rise, you balance, and you only fall once. You're sitting before a gilded mirror in your private chambers now, fingertips resting lightly on your collarbone, trying to remember how to breathe. Behind you, your maid is brushing your hair with a comb made of ivory and mother of pearl. But her hands aren't what's making your heart race. It's the whispers, the knowing glances, the sudden shift in the air around the court. Because now, it's not just your beauty or your wit that's under scrutiny, it's your past, specifically your virginity or lack thereof, And you know as well as anyone, this palace loves a scandal more than it loves a coronation. Let's talk about the virginity lie, the elaborate, whispered and sometimes disturbingly creative effort to prove, fake, or cover up a woman's sexual history before she became queen or mistress. Because in a royal court, purity wasn't just a virtue, it was political currency, and if you were found to have spent your maiden days in anything less than complete chastity, well, it didn't matter how charming you were damaged goods, untouchable, or if you were clever, completely untouched, officially anyway. This mattered most if you were a queen in waiting. Royals, especially those born into powerful European dynasties, were expected to be physically, emotionally and sexually unspoiled before marriage. It wasn't just about propriety, it was about lineage, bloodlines. If there was even a whisper that your womb might produce a child who wasn't of pure descent, treaties could be broken, alliances could unravel, and wars could begin. So of course every effort was made to ensure you were a blank slate, a sealed envelope. Except, of course, many weren't. Some women entered marriage with complicated pasts, secret affairs, lost loves, and in some cases, rumoured pregnancies that had been hastily erased from history. And yet they still became queens. How? Through carefully constructed lies, loyal staff, and a network of silence strong enough to make a monastery proud. Here's how it worked. If you had a situation in your past, your family did everything to bury it. Midwives were paid, letters destroyed, servants dismissed and relocated, preferably very far away. If a pregnancy had occurred, the child was whisked away, sometimes to a convent, sometimes to the countryside, and occasionally to an early grave if the court was particularly ruthless. And if it hadn't gone that far, then all you had to do was look innocent and say nothing convincingly. One method of faking virginity, yes, we're going there, involved using small bits of sponge or sheep's bladder during the wedding night, sometimes even pricked fingers to provide the expected proof on the sheets. Other brides simply relied on the king being too drunk, too inexperienced, or too indifferent to notice. And if he didn't complain, well, the rest of the court would follow his lead. There's a particularly infamous case involving Queen Christina of Sweden. Though never married, she faced endless speculation about her sexual history. Was she chaste? Was she having secret affairs? Was she even interested in men? Historians still debate it. She eventually abdicated and converted to Catholicism, which only added layers of mystery to her already scandal-drenched reputation. But what's clear is that even a whiff of suspicion around a woman's purity could define her entire legacy. Some women embraced the lie as armour. They cultivated the image of untouched virtue so flawlessly that even their enemies dared not question it. These queens turned modesty into a weapon, demure smiles, lowered eyes, soft voices dripping with innocence. They wore white in portraits and spoke often of piety. Meanwhile, some had entire bedrooms furnished for secret meetings with lovers. History is filled with these quiet contradictions, and here's the thing, the double standard was breathtaking. Kings, of course, were rarely virgins on their wedding night. They were expected to be seasoned, worldly, and possibly halfway drunk from years of debauchery. If anything, the more mistresses a king had, the more virile and powerful he seemed. But a queen? Her value lay entirely in the idea that she was untouched, her past clean, her body unopened like a diplomatic scroll. You can imagine how galling that must have been. There's even an old German phrase, Jungfernschein, referring to a certificate of virginity, not metaphorical, an actual document, sometimes issued by a physician after an exam. And yes, the practice occasionally made its way into royal courts, as if a scrap of parchment could somehow vouch for someone's innocence better than, say, the person herself. It wasn't about truth, it was about the illusion of it. Historians still argue over how often these deceptions worked. Some say they were common, cleverly orchestrated performances that fooled entire kingdoms. Others insist the court always knew, but chose to overlook it for the sake of diplomacy or convenience. What's clear is that the pressure was unbearable. Women were expected to be spotless, while men were encouraged to be thoroughly wrinkled. Even among mistresses, the past mattered. A new royal favourite who had a history might still be welcomed, but she'd be viewed through a different lens, exotic, risky, seductive. Her past lovers would become court gossip. Her reputation, a weapon. The clever ones owned it. They laughed at the rumours, leaned into the danger, made it part of their appeal. But even they knew, one wrong step and the whisper of scandal could become a roar. So tonight, as you fall asleep in your real-world bed, free from chambermaids whispering about your virtue, be glad for the world we live in, complicated as it is, because in that glittering, gilded world of royalty, a woman's worth often rested on whether someone believed her story, not whether it was true. And in the palaces of history, belief always mattered more than truth. Let's open a different door tonight, the one barely marked, down a candle-lit hallway, behind a tapestry of a saint that no one ever really looked at too closely. Push it open, and what do you find? Secrets, mischief, masks, and one of the strangest, most absurd little corners of palace history, bed tricks and mistaken identity. Because when your life is confined by protocol and your love life has more rules than chess, sometimes the only way to get what you want, or to avoid what you don't, is to swap the players, literally. The bed trick is one of those bizarre historical phenomena that sounds made up, except it wasn't. It's a scenario where someone, usually a woman, is switched out in the dark for another woman in a royal bed. It happened in literature. Yes, Shakespeare loved the idea. But it also happened in real life, and when it did, the consequences were explosive. Imagine this. You're a young noblewoman, politically valuable but personally undesirable to the king. He's not interested in you, your face doesn't dazzle him, your voice doesn't thrill him, and worse, he's already got a mistress he can't keep his hands off of. But the alliance must go through, the marriage must be consummated, the bed must be occupied. So your family or your advisors arrange for a little nighttime switcheroo. The king is half drunk, the candles are low, and your more agreeable stand-in is ushered into bed wearing your perfume and veil. He does what's expected. He never knows the difference. Until he does. Because here's the thing, it never stays a secret. Maybe someone speaks, maybe he sees the real bride in daylight and realises the curve of her lips isn't quite right. Maybe the swapped woman grows bold, or maybe a chambermaid gets paid a little too well and starts whispering. There's a semi-legendary story still debated by historians about a noblewoman in the Polish court who allegedly had her more seductive cousin sleep with her husband on their wedding night because she was too frightened to endure the encounter. The cousin unfortunately became pregnant. Cue panic, shame, and a disastrous family scandal that ended with both women removed from court entirely. No one's certain where the truth lies, but the tale's persistence says a lot about how believable such a scenario actually was. And bed tricks weren't always about consent or strategy. Sometimes they were used to trap people. A nobleman might think he was sleeping with his mistress, only to discover he had been tricked into bedding his betrothed, now legally and politically bound. The medieval version of a shotgun wedding. There are documented cases of such incidents in various German and Italian courts, where arranged marriages were sealed not by ceremony but by a successful deception under sheets. Even royals weren't above this sleight of hand. In some stories, especially those told quietly among palace staff, kings themselves orchestrated the trick. A queen was ill or unappealing, and so he'd have a mistress sneak in disguised. If anyone asked, well, the marriage had been fulfilled, hadn't it? It was plausible deniability served with candlelight and silk sheets. There's one especially scandalous account involving a French noblewoman and a cardinal. She allegedly used a maid to impersonate her during a nighttime tryst, just to avoid confrontation. When the cardinal found out, he retaliated, not through violence, but by writing a scathing public letter condemning her morals, which promptly tanked her reputation. Not exactly the revenge plot of a Netflix drama, but in 17th century France, a ruined reputation was worse than poison. The funnier side of this? It often did involve mistaken identity. Royal palaces were full of masks, masquerades, carnivals, and dances where everyone wore the same powdered wig and embroidered coat. The lighting was poor, and half the nobility was nearsighted. There's more than one account of a duke or prince propositioning the wrong woman entirely, only to realise too late. And since scandal stuck like wax to velvet, the fallout could be disastrous, or occasionally weirdly beneficial. In one instance, a nobleman accidentally seduced a higher-ranking lady than he intended, and ended up promoted after the king assumed it was ambition, not clumsiness. Another time, a royal mistress caught her rival sneaking into the king's chambers and dressed as a maid herself to follow. The result? A confrontation so dramatic it had to be broken up by 3 guards and a confused priest. And while it might all sound theatrical now, these deceptions were high-stakes games. Royal marriages and titles hinged on whether or not someone had been truly touched. If the wrong woman ended up in the bed, intentionally or not, dynasties could wobble. Children could be disinherited. Alliances could collapse. You weren't just swapping people, you were swapping futures. Of course, historians argue about how often this really happened. Some say it's mostly myth, born from the dramatic imaginations of gossipy courtiers and 18th century pamphleteers. Others argue that the nature of court life, its shadows, its constant role-play, its obsession with sexual reputation, made it inevitable. If love was forbidden and sex was scripted, then deception was the only form of freedom left. One fringe fact worth savouring: in a few extreme cases, royals would demand that intimate encounters be witnessed, not for pleasure but to prevent bed tricks. Actual witnesses to the consummation, as if love was a legal contract requiring a notary. The modern equivalent would be hiring a referee to verify your honeymoon. It's absurd, and it was real. So tonight, as you pull up your covers and dim the lights, imagine that for every great royal love story there might be a hidden switch, a mistaken identity, a last-minute swap behind the bed curtains, and behind every whispered royal birth announcement, a small possibility that someone, somewhere, got away with the greatest trick of all, sleeping in someone else's life. The palace wakes early, bells echo through the halls, maids rush to shake out linens, and servants creep into chambers to rekindle dying embers. You're already awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what you'll be expected to endure today. But this morning something's different. Not with you, but with him, the king, your husband, the centre of the royal solar system, and the whispers are already starting. He's unwell, they say. He's avoiding the Queen's chambers, avoiding you, not even visiting the mistresses. And now everyone's glancing at each other and speaking in hushed voices, because the problem isn't politics or plague. It's in his bed. More specifically, it's in his breeches. Let's talk about something that rarely makes it into the gilded portraits and flattering court memoirs: royal sexual dysfunction. Because yes, even kings, divine, powdered, silk-draped kings, had performance issues. And when they did, it wasn't a private matter. It was a full-blown political emergency. Nothing threatens a dynasty like a limp royal scepter. Start with the basics. A king was expected to be virile. A warrior in the field, a conqueror in the bedroom. His body was considered symbolic of the strength of the nation. So when something went wrong, when a marriage went unconsummated, or when no heirs were produced despite frequent visits to the Queen's chambers, the whispers began. Is he incapable? One of the most famously documented cases was Louis VI of France. His marriage to Marie Antoinette was not consummated for several years, and people noticed. Oh, did they notice? Foreign courts sent snide dispatches. French pamphlets turned it into satire. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette was being quietly blamed, accused of being frigid, spiteful, or worse, disloyal. The truth? The young king was almost certainly suffering from a minor anatomical condition, easily fixed but too embarrassing to discuss openly. By the time he finally received treatment, the damage to their public image was already done, and this wasn't an isolated incident. Henry VIII, famous for his parade of wives and dramatic divorces, struggled with impotence later in life. Historians point to stress, obesity, and a charming list of untreated infections as the likely culprits, but at the time his failures in bed were translated into political instability. No heir, no stability, no performance, no legitimacy. Suddenly his desperate pursuit of a male child made a lot more sense. So what happened when a king couldn't perform? First came the denials. He's just tired. It's the Queen's fault. The moon is in the wrong phase. If that didn't quiet the court, out came the physicians. These poor men were tasked with solving the most delicate mystery of all: what's wrong with the royal member? Examinations were conducted, potions were brewed. Cures ranged from a crushed antler powder and bull testicle soup to mercury pills, which unsurprisingly did not help and usually just made the king feel worse. And if the king was especially stubborn, the blame shifted entirely to the Queen. It was easier, after all, to call a woman barren or cold than to admit that the problem sat on the throne. Queens were forced to undergo humiliating fertility evaluations, even when their husbands couldn't produce more than a half-hearted kiss goodnight. One Habsburg empress was examined by multiple priests and physicians over the course of 2 years before anyone thought to question whether the emperor was doing his part. Mistresses didn't escape this either. If a royal mistress failed to become pregnant, or if she simply wasn't glowing enough, the king's masculinity was questioned. So to fix the perception, many monarchs began staging their virility. public flirtations, exaggerated boasts, children paraded through court as symbols of fertility, even if their parentage was suspect. One Spanish king allegedly faked love letters from female admirers and had them discovered by courtiers to prove his irresistible allure. Here's a fringe detail. Some kings employed court astrologers or mystics to determine whether celestial forces were interfering with their love lives. One Italian duke reportedly blamed his impotence on a curse cast by a jilted chambermaid. He spent weeks locked in his quarters, receiving strange rituals, potions and, wait for it, sunlight therapy. It didn't work, but the man had glowing skin by the end of it. Of course, not every case was medical. Some kings just lost interest. Politics, grief, boredom, or sheer exhaustion turned their passions cold. But in court that looked the same as dysfunction. So queens and mistresses alike were left trying to interpret every silence, every cancelled visit, every distant look. Was he ill? Was he angry? Was it her fault? The pressure to fix the problem quietly, delicately, without bruising his ego, was relentless. And if the issue couldn't be fixed, sometimes it was rewritten entirely. Royal records were adjusted. Historians commissioned flattering biographies. Lovers were erased from letters, or new ones were invented to fill the gaps. The royal body, after all, had to remain symbolic. Strong, potent, eternal. The idea that a king could suffer the same frailties as common men, unacceptable, which is why entire marriages were sometimes annulled under the polite excuse of non-consummation, and the real cause, royal dysfunction, was locked away behind velvet curtains. Some historians argue that these cases reveal the fragility of royal masculinity, that the need to perform was more about optics than intimacy. Others suggest these stories were exaggerated, inflated by rival courts to undermine a king's image. But even if the dysfunction was whispered rather than witnessed, it left deep cracks in the image of absolute power. Tonight, as you curl into your own unobserved, pressure-free bed, remember the kings who couldn't. Not because they lacked desire or love or bravery, but because their bodies betrayed them in a world that demanded perfection. And remember the queens who bore the burden for something they couldn't control, the mistresses who were discarded for failing to inspire, the physicians who whispered bad news behind heavy doors, because in the palaces of power even passion was politics, and not every king could rise to meet it. You've played your part well, queen, mistress, courtesan or pawn. You've danced, you've smiled, you've curtsied until your knees ached, and now you're exhausted, not just physically, but soul deep. Because behind the opulence of the palace, behind the jewelled hairpins and carefully arranged smiles, lies a brutal truth. You were never truly free to choose this life. You were chosen for it. Shipped off like a prized possession, sold to a crown for the sake of diplomacy, bloodlines, and dynastic glory. Welcome to the nightmare of the royal marriage market. Imagine being 14, maybe 15 if you're lucky. You live in a castle you'll soon forget the name of. Your education includes embroidery, religious piety, and long, stiff lessons in how to stand beside a man you've never met. One day your father walks in holding a scroll. He's smiling. This means something terrible is about to happen. You're to be wed, he says. And just like that, your life, your body, your future, it's no longer yours. Royal and noble daughters weren't raised with dreams of love. They were groomed to be strategic pieces in the diplomatic puzzle. A marriage wasn't a celebration. It was a treaty with perfume on it. Marriages between royal houses were arranged years in advance, often sealed before the bride had her adult teeth. And when the time came, she was expected to pack her silks, say farewell to everything familiar, and cross borders like a sacrificial lamb in a pearl-trimmed carriage. And what was waiting on the other side? A husband often twice her age, sometimes older, a foreign language, a court where every servant already disliked her, a bed that came with an audience, her own name sometimes stripped away and replaced with a more fitting one. Her purpose was singular: make heirs, male ones preferably, and until she did, she was watched, gossiped about, and quietly pitied. One of the most heart-wrenching examples is Catherine of Aragon, sent from Spain to England at the age of 15 to marry Prince Arthur. The poor girl barely had time to settle him before he died. She was left stranded in a foreign land, her dowry contested, her future uncertain. Eventually she married his younger brother, Henry VIII, and we all know how that went. But it's easy to forget that for years Catherine lived in limbo. mourning a husband she barely knew, surrounded by courtiers who debated her value like merchants haggling over spice. And she was one of the lucky ones. At least she stayed in one place. Some princesses were promised to one kingdom, then rerouted at the last moment for a better offer. You might spend your childhood studying French manners, only to be married off to a Bavarian duke with a limp and a bad temper. One Habsburg princess prepared for her future queenhood in Spain, learning Castilian, dancing court dances, only to be married off to the Holy Roman Emperor instead, dropped into a completely different political and cultural sphere with no warning. There's a fringe little ritual known as the proxy marriage, where the bride would be symbolically wed before even meeting her groom. A nobleman would stand in, often wearing the groom's ring or carrying a token. The ceremony would be official, legal, binding, and surreal. In some cases, the bride would even share a bed with the proxy, clothed usually, to simulate the future arrangement, all for the sake of appearances. When the actual journey began, it wasn't a romantic voyage. It was a long, uncomfortable ride through enemy lands, hostile weather, and sometimes literal danger. One Medici bride travelled to France with an entourage so large it nearly bankrupted her father, and still arrived to cold stares and muttered slurs. Another bride was made to change into foreign clothes mid-journey, in a ritual designed to strip her of her native identity. Everything, her language, her gods, her customs, was to be replaced. And the worst part? You had no choice. If you objected, you were rebellious. If you cried, you were weak. If you tried to run, you were punished. In one particularly tragic case, a teenage girl tried to elope with a tutor rather than marry the decrepit duke she'd been assigned. She was caught, beaten, and promptly locked in a convent for the rest of her life. Romance, royal styles. Scholars often debate whether these women had any agency at all. Some argue that queens found subtle ways to wield power through influence, children, or strategic alliances. Others say that their lives were so tightly scripted, even their triumphs were merely pre-approved illusions. Either way, one thing is certain. Love was rarely on the itinerary. Mistresses didn't escape this fate entirely. Many were pushed into court life by ambitious families, hoping their daughters might attract royal attention. They were coached in flirtation, dressed in suggestive silks, and handed over like shiny bribes. And once chosen, they were expected to remain faithful to the king, to the court, to the very role itself, even if it meant suppressing every real emotion they ever had. And it wasn't just the women who paid the price. Children born of these unions often inherited the bitterness. They were raised by strangers, groomed for the same transactional lives. Some became monarchs themselves, forever haunted by the memory of mothers they barely knew, and fathers who only visited when it served their image. So tonight, if you ever find yourself fantasizing about being swept into palace life by some handsome royal in breeches, think twice. Because more often than not, those royal stories didn't begin with love. They began with silence, a long ride, a heavy dress, and a quiet realization as the gates of a foreign castle loomed ahead that your life was no longer yours. Not now, not ever. So there you are, freshly married, a queen in name, or a mistress by strategic appointment. Your hair has been styled, your linens embroidered, and you're now expected to perform like a seasoned diplomat, fashion icon, and dynastic broodmare, all before you've figured out how not to trip over your new shoes. But there's one crucial skill you're expected to possess, though no one wants to say it outright. You're supposed to know what to do in bed. You're supposed to know how to please the king, how to conceive an heir, how to balance a sense of mystery with performance. And yet, here's the problem. No one ever really tells you how. Welcome to Sex Education Palace Style. Let's start with the queens. You'd think they'd get a full curriculum before being shipped off to marry a king, right? Not quite. Most royal girls were raised in strict households where modesty was prized above all. Words like intercourse or orgasm, or even nipple, were not uttered. Not by tutors, not by mothers, and definitely not by confessors. Instead, they were told vague phrases like, "A woman must obey," "There will be duties," or the ever-haunting, "You'll understand when the time comes." Spoiler alert, they usually didn't. In many cases, the only education a royal bride received came days, sometimes hours before her wedding night. A nervous aunt or older noblewoman might pull her aside for a hushed conversation filled with euphemisms and half-truths. The man will come to your room. Don't fight him, don't talk, lie still, it'll be unpleasant. But it's necessary. And that was it. No diagrams, no questions allowed, just cryptic warnings and a pat on the hand followed by by being shoved into a bed the size of a rowing boat next to a stranger with a title and political obligations. Now, if you were lucky, or if your court was slightly less prudish, you might be given a manual. That's right. Some courts circulated handwritten instruction books for new brides. These ranged from religiously sanitized nonsense to shockingly graphic medical advice. One 17th century noblewoman in Germany reportedly received a pamphlet detailing the unification of man's seed and woman's basin, which is both confusing and kind of hilarious. Some of these guides encouraged emotional detachment. Others were written by monks and included prayers to be said during intercourse. Nothing says romance like whispering amen while trying not to flinch. Mistresses, on the other hand, got a slightly different education. Often raised in court or noble households, they were trained in the art of flirtation, how to dance, how to walk, how to flash a smile just long enough to be noticed. Many had mentors, older courtesans or former mistresses, who taught them more practical skills. How to disrobe elegantly, how to speak softly in the dark, how to make the king feel powerful even when he was clearly a confused pile of lace and libido. One famous French courtesan was known to give lessons to rising mistresses. She taught them the rules of seduction, which included timing their laughs, adjusting their corsets to emphasize cleavage at the exact right angle, and, most importantly, never showing true emotion. The goal wasn't pleasure. The goal was control. You were taught to be a mirror, reflecting what the man wanted to see. But here's where it gets truly absurd. Sometimes the men didn't know what they were doing either. Imagine two teenagers, one a sheltered princess, the other a barely educated prince raised by tutors and soldiers, thrust into a ceremonial bed and told, "Make an heir." The awkwardness was unbearable. Many royal couples failed to consummate their marriages for weeks, even months. Some didn't know how, some were too embarrassed to ask. In fact, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette struggled with this exact issue. Rumour has it they didn't consummate their marriage for 7 years. Historians suspect a combination of inexperience, lack of communication, and possibly a minor medical issue on Louis's end. Either way, both were left fumbling in the dark while the entire court speculated about their sex life. Imagine trying to figure out your body, your partner's body, and basic anatomy, all while ministers and foreign ambassadors wait for an official "it happened" report. And if you did try to ask questions, good luck. Religious advisors would tell you to focus on duty, not pleasure. Physicians might offer mechanical advice. Insert tab A into slot B, but rarely talked about affection or connection. Some brides were told that sex was meant to be painful and that suffering through it was part of a virtuous wife's burden. It's amazing more royal marriages didn't end in trauma and therapy bills, though to be fair, therapy hadn't been invented yet. A few more progressive courts did attempt education. In Venice, noble women sometimes visited midwives before marriage for advice. In the Ottoman Empire, palace concubines were trained in sexual technique and etiquette as part of their grooming, and in France certain brothels were rumoured to give noble sons practice sessions, with older courtesans before marriage, basically the worst gap year imaginable. But again, these were the exceptions, and let's not forget, misinformation ran wild. Some women believed that passion alone could make you pregnant. Others thought staring at beautiful art would influence the child's appearance. One queen allegedly panicked after sex because she hadn't said a prayer beforehand and was convinced she had invited a demon into her womb. This is what happens when your education is designed to keep you obedient instead of informed. Historians still argue whether this was intentional. Some say royal women were kept ignorant on purpose to ensure their compliance and eliminate resistance. Others argue that society itself was so steeped in repression and religious guilt that even the most well-meaning parents simply didn't know what to teach. Either way, the result was the same: fear, confusion, and a lot of silent tears shed into embroidered pillows. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in, hopefully with more bodily autonomy than the average 16th century duchess, spare a thought for those royal women who were expected to perform perfectly without ever being told how, who were handed crowns without instructions, beds without guidance, and lives where asking questions was more dangerous than ignorance itself. Because in the world of royalty, even sex came with a script, and no one gave you the lines. You're standing in a garden now, the kind designed to be admired, not touched, where roses are trimmed into unnatural obedience and marble fountains whisper more secrets than the courtiers ever will. The palace looms behind you, but for a moment it feels like the world has faded. Another woman sits beside you. She's not a rival. She's not your maid. She's something else. You catch her gaze, and the look lingers longer than it should. There's a spark, unspoken but undeniable. And just like that, we've entered the territory no court wanted to admit existed. Same-sex attraction in royal spaces. The thing that wasn't supposed to happen, but happened all the same. Let's be clear, palaces were obsessed with sex. Obsessed with controlling it, defining it, assigning it roles. And yet, beneath the strictures and the rules, desire found ways to bloom in unexpected corners. Sometimes it was subtle, a queen's affection for her lady-in-waiting that went deeper than protocol. Other times it was flagrantly defiant. Passionate letters between courtiers, secret rendezvous in moonlit corridors, moments stolen behind closed doors that everyone suspected, but no one dared say aloud. Royal courts weren't blind to same-sex relationships, they just chose to pretend they weren't happening, unless of course they needed to weaponize them, and they often did. Take Queen Christina of Sweden. She dressed in men's clothes, preferred the company of women, and refused to marry despite endless pressure. Her intense relationships with several women, including her lady-in-waiting Ebba Spare, were the subject of whispered gossip across Europe. Christina even called Ebba her bedfellow, and once described her as the delight of my eyes. While historians still argue about whether the relationship was romantic, the fact that the court treated it like a scandal tells you everything. Christina eventually abdicated, moved to Rome, and continued to be gloriously confusing to everyone around her. Icon behaviour. Then there's Anne, Queen of Great Britain. Her relationship with Sarah Churchill, yes, that Churchill family, was famously intense, documented in a series of letters that don't read like anything close to political. Anne wrote to Sarah with longing, jealousy and desperation. When their friendship soured, Anne was devastated. Sarah's replacement, Abigail Masham, caused even more turmoil, both personal and political. Rumours spread that Anne had replaced one lover with another. Whether true or not, the fallout was very real. Now, were these relationships sexual? Some probably were, some might not have been, but what matters is that they existed in a world that claimed they shouldn't. Same-sex attraction in royal circles was always forced into shadow, dismissed as intimate friendship, emotional closeness, or simply erased from records. And yet the passion behind those letters and the lengths people went to hide or sabotage such connections speak volumes. Even among royal men, same-sex relationships weren't unheard of. King James I of England had several deeply affectionate, and some say romantic, relationships with male courtiers, most notably George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. James openly referred to him as his sweet child and wife in letters. It was more than politics, it was yearning. In France, the Duc d'Orléans, brother of Louis XIV, was notorious for his male lovers and flamboyant dress. He married twice and fathered several children, but spent most of his time with his favourites, often scandalising the court with his open defiance of heterosexual norms. He was tolerated barely because of his status, but never respected in the same way as his more conventionally masculine peers. Still, he didn't hide. And in a way, that made him powerful. But for women, it was far more dangerous. A queen or noblewoman caught in a same-sex affair risked exile, imprisonment, or worse. Because while a king might be forgiven for indulgent behaviour with a handsome valet, a woman was supposed to be pure, submissive, and entirely focused on bearing children. Loving another woman didn't fit into that role, and so it became something to be punished, or more often silenced. There's a fringe case from the Spanish court involving a duchess and a female painter who became inseparable. They were accused of inappropriate attachment, a vague phrase that often masked far deeper accusations. The painter was dismissed quietly. The duchess was married off to a brutal nobleman in another province. The implication was clear. Don't get clever, don't get close. But here's the thing, in the rigid world of royal life, same-sex attraction made sense. Who else truly understood what it felt like to be watched constantly? Who else endured the same suffocating expectations, the same pressure to marry, to breed, to smile through it all? It was only natural that deep emotional bonds would form, that those bonds might become physical, or romantic, or both. Some queens reportedly chose their ladies-in-waiting as lovers, carefully rotating favourites and arranging their days to ensure privacy. Others developed intense, lifelong emotional partnerships that defied all court gossip. And among mistresses, same-sex experimentation wasn't uncommon, especially in courts like Versailles, where boundaries were pushed and taboos bent under the weight of decadence. Still, historians continue to debate the nature of these relationships. Were they romantic, sexual, platonic, but passionate? The lines blur, partly because the language used at the time was deliberately vague. Women were encouraged to express affection in flowery prose, to kiss one another in greeting, to sleep in the same bed for warmth. That doesn't make every case romantic, but it certainly provided cover for the ones that were. And even when there were no lovers, just longing, the pain was real. Imagine being a young queen, married off at 15, falling quietly in love with your lady-in-waiting, a woman who makes you laugh, who brings you small gifts, who touches your wrist just a moment too long, and knowing you can never speak it, never act on it, never admit it, because to do so would be to risk everything. Your crown, your future, your life. So you smile, you bury it. Or maybe you let it bloom in secret, in stolen moments, in midnight letters no one will ever read. As you close your eyes tonight, think about those unspoken stories, the hidden glances in the gardens, the letters burned before dawn, the love that bloomed behind a curtain of silence, just as real, just as aching as any royal match made under stained glass and trumpets. Because not all courtly love wore a crown, some wore a whisper. The palace smells different tonight. Not just candle wax and old wood, there's something else in the air. Musk, jasmine. A strange spicy note that doesn't quite belong. You recognise it from earlier, when one of the ladies in waiting dabbed something behind your ears and muttered, "For courage." Another rubbed oil into your hands before you were dressed, claiming it would open the womb. All of them said the same thing in different ways. You have to be ready. Ready for what? For him, of course. For the king. For sex that will hopefully lead to an heir. So you breathe in the scent and the pressure, and prepare to perform, not for pleasure but for production. Let's talk about the tools of seduction behind the royal curtain. The ancient murky world of aphrodisiacs, perfumes, and the pseudo-science of arousal. Because in a time before hormones were mapped and desire was considered chemical, queens and mistresses relied on something older and far more unpredictable: potions, scents, and superstition. Perfume was the first weapon of choice. And it wasn't just about smelling nice. These weren't light, floral fragrances designed to flirt with the air. They were dense, musky concoctions brewed in apothecaries using ingredients like ambergris, whale secretion, civet from the glands of wildcats, and musk from deer. If that sounds animalistic and slightly disgusting, congratulations, you're catching on. That was the point. These were primal smells designed to stir something deep in the senses, to wake up the blood, to suggest things no court lady could say aloud. Some queens were rumoured to wear different scents depending on their goal. Jasmine and orange blossom when they wanted to appear pure and fertile. Patchouli and musk when they wanted to drive the king mad. Madame de Pompadour supposedly bathed in rosewater and dabbed a custom blend behind her knees and inside her wrists. Subtle, but devastatingly effective. Catherine de Medici's perfumer created entire cabinets of aphrodisiac oils and powders for her private use. And yes, she shared with her favourites. But perfume was just the beginning. The royal world was obsessed with substances believed to spark desire or enhance performance. Love potions weren't just folklore, they were part of the courtly toolkit. Herbs like damiana, yohimbe, ginseng, and even mandrake root were dried, ground, steeped into teas or added to wine. In some cases, they were slipped into a king's drink without his knowledge, just to get things going. A desperate queen might stir powdered staghorn into a broth and serve it with trembling hands. Did it work? Who knows? But in a palace full of pressure and public scrutiny, belief itself could become a powerful aphrodisiac. Then there were the foods. Oysters were favoured for obvious slippery reasons. Honey was considered a fertility booster. Almonds, chocolate, and figs were staples in the royal bedchamber. In France, asparagus was served before state beds were entered, phallus-shaped and full of suggestion. Eggs, with their delicate, fragile shells and potent centres, were said to increase female receptivity, and wine, especially spiced with cinnamon or clove, was believed to quicken the pulse and melt inhibition. None of this was scientifically proven, of course, but no one needed science. They needed results. Let's not forget charms and talismans, because even the most polished queen kept a secret pouch hidden in her bodice. A small satchel of herbs, a carved stone from a pilgrimage site, a token from a midwife or healer promising fruitfulness. One Habsburg bride carried a dried frog's heart wrapped in silk between her breasts on her wedding night. Another aristocrat in the French court kept a coin with her husband's name etched into it tied to her thigh, believing it would bind his desire. It's both quaint and chilling. Love reduced to folklore and animal parts, worn beneath layers of brocade. And if these tricks didn't work, the blame almost always fell on the woman. If a king was cold, it meant you weren't alluring enough. If he wandered, you must have failed to ignite him. So women turned to the last line of defence, visual seduction. They wore colours thought to inspire lust, deep reds, midnight blues, golds that shimmered in candlelight. Necklines lowered just slightly, sleeves tightened to emphasise the arm. Even fans, those innocent little props, were used in flirtation, opened slowly, close quickly, glance over the edge. Every movement became part of a carefully crafted erotic ballet. And here's a twisted little fringe fact. Some royal mistresses paid alchemists for elixirs that supposedly made their skin glow with youth, or increased natural pheromones. One Italian noblewoman consumed small amounts of crushed pearl daily, believing it made her breath more enticing. Another ate violets and mint leaves before any royal visit, in hopes of making her kisses taste sweet. Some even resorted to poisons in minuscule controlled doses, arsenic beauty tonics that whitened the skin and gave the cheeks a false flush. They were flirting with death just to look desirable. The scholarly debate rages on. Did any of it actually work? Probably not in the way people hoped. But then again, these weren't scientific formulas. They were coping mechanisms, desperation channeled through rituals. In a world where sex was duty, performance and scrutiny, even the illusion of control was a lifeline. So if slipping mandrake oil behind your ears helped you walk into the king's chamber with your head high, then maybe it did work, in the only way that mattered. Because these women weren't trying to seduce out of whimsy. They were seducing to survive, to keep their position, to hold a man's gaze long enough to delay replacement. To remain relevant in a court that aged you the moment your cheeks lost their flush. Aphrodisiacs weren't just about arousal, they were about protection. So tonight, as you exhale beneath your own scentless sheets, be grateful you don't need powdered boar tusk or frog hearts to hold your place in someone's life. In the palace, a woman's desirability was measured not by affection, but by effectiveness. Passion wasn't just personal, it was performance. And the scent of power? That was the real aphrodisiac. The morning begins with footsteps in the hallway. Quick, deliberate, never rushing, but always just short of polite. You're still in bed, propped against embroidered cushions, your skin pale under the sheen of your nightgown. You haven't been feeling right. Not sick exactly, but off. Swollen in places, too warm, a little dizzy. You haven't bled in weeks, and the court is already murmuring. A physician is coming, not because you asked, but because the palace wants answers. Is the queen with child? Is the mistress gaining favour by bearing royal blood? You pull the covers up to your chin and wait for the doctor to examine what you hoped might stay private. But in the palace, privacy is a luxury no one truly owns. Welcome to the world of royal doctors and their bedside exams, an awkward, often humiliating intersection between medicine, politics and sex. Because when it came to royal women, physicians weren't just healers, they were verifiers, gatekeepers, and in many cases, reluctant voyeurs tasked with ensuring that a queen's body was performing according to dynastic expectations. Let's set the scene. You're lying in a grand bed surrounded by velvet curtains, gold leaf detailing on the ceiling above, and a small crowd of silent women standing awkwardly nearby, ladies in waiting, attendants, possibly even a relative or two. A physician arrives, often an older man with bushy eyebrows and the unmistakable scent of herbal tinctures clinging to his coat. He bows. He does not smile. He sits by your side and begins asking intrusive questions in the most clinical tone imaginable. Have your breasts changed? Any nausea? Swelling? Tenderness? The conversation feels more like an interrogation than a checkup. And then comes the examination. In the modern world, this would be done with care, discretion, perhaps even kindness. Not here. Here the procedure is ceremonial, observed, documented. Your body is not your own. It is a subject of inquiry. The physician palpates your abdomen, checks your pulse, may even taste your urine, yes, really, to determine whether a pregnancy has begun. In some cases, he'll press his ear to your belly, hoping to detect the quickening the moment a fetus begins to move. And if you're not pregnant, well, the questions don't stop. They get worse. Because if you're not carrying a child, someone must be blamed. Did the king visit your chamber often enough? Was he successful? Was something wrong with you? Your monthly cycle is charted by others. Your temperature is recorded. Your appetite discussed behind your back. One court physician in 17th century Austria was known to visit the Queen's bedchamber every morning just to observe her breakfast habits, believing that cravings for salted meat indicated pregnancy. He was wrong, often, but no one corrected him. Mistresses were subject to similar intrusions, especially if the Queen was failing to conceive. The moment a mistress showed signs of fatigue, changes in skin, or even the mildest case of indigestion, court physicians were called in to assess whether she might be carrying a potential heir. And if she was, oh, the excitement. Ministers would start drafting letters, servants would prepare new apartments, and the Queen, she would feel the floor shifting beneath her feet. But here's the most twisted part. Even if the king didn't authorise it, the exam still happened. The state needed to know. A physician's report could spark or silence a war. One misdiagnosed pregnancy could result in a political alliance being signed or cancelled. There are documented cases where women faked symptoms just to maintain favour a little longer. One mistress kept up a false pregnancy for nearly 3 months, stuffing her bodice, avoiding exams, and claiming delicate health. It worked until she fainted at a banquet, and the ruse came crashing down in front of a room full of diplomats. And what about illness? Anything to do with the reproductive system was automatically linked to sexual performance. A royal woman complaining of abdominal pain might be accused of excessive lust or demonic influence. Yes, that was a thing. In Tudor England, a queen who miscarried was sometimes treated with bleeding, cold compresses, or even forced fasting, as if punishment might somehow restore her fertility. One French queen was made to sleep with a toad tied to her thigh in an effort to draw out the disease. The toad did not survive. On the other hand, if a king had his own issues, impotence, disinterest, or outright avoidance, the royal doctors usually didn't mention it. They couldn't. Speaking of a king's failures was dangerous, so instead they circled the issue with the elaborate euphemisms. His Majesty suffers from a chill. His humours are unbalanced. He is preoccupied with affairs of state. Meanwhile, the woman continued to be examined, diagnosed, and more often than not blamed. Here's a bizarre fringe fact. In 18th century Russia, Empress Elizabeth's court maintained a sex calendar for noble marriages. Physicians and astrologers worked together to determine the most auspicious nights for intimacy, and couples were instructed to perform accordingly. The idea was to increase fertility through timing. In practice, it turned sex into a bureaucratic task, complete with official approvals and morning check-ins. And what if a woman resisted? What if she refused to be examined? It didn't go well. Refusing the physician was treated as suspicious, possibly treasonous. A queen who denied access to her body was essentially denying the nation's right to its future. Some women complied through gritted teeth. Others wept. A few begged to be spared. But the physician came anyway, because the monarchy couldn't afford uncertainty. Historians still argue about whether these physicians genuinely believed in what they were doing, or whether they were complicit in a larger system of control. Some seemed sincerely invested in the well-being of their royal patients. Others were power-hungry men who enjoyed the influence, the proximity to royalty, the chance to play God with a stethoscope made of wood and saltpeter. But either way, their role was clear. To report on the female body like it was a weather pattern, public, predictable, and always subject to interpretation. So as you lie in your own bed tonight, untouched by state doctors and free from pregnancy rumours, remember what it meant to be a royal woman in history. Your body wasn't just yours, it was a matter of national interest, prodded and poked in the name of destiny. And no matter how regal your title, you were always just a few missed periods away from being examined like livestock. It's late. Too late for music. Too late for ceremony. The candles in your chamber have burned low, and the palace is finally quiet. The kind of quiet that only ever comes after midnight, when even the guards have stopped pretending to be alert. You lie still in bed, staring at the draped canopy above, your hands resting over the curve of your stomach. It aches, not sharply but constantly. You try to breathe slowly, to ignore it, but deep down you know this isn't normal. Something's wrong, and you know what happens next, because every queen and mistress before you knew it too. In this world, sex could be deadly, and childbirth even more so. Let's talk about the terror that sat quietly beside every royal bed, the looming spectre of dying in childbirth. Because for all the court gossip about seduction, heirs and fertility, none of it meant anything if you couldn't survive the thing you were most praised for. Giving birth wasn't a celebratory moment. It was a high-stakes gamble, a dance on the edge of life and death. And you were the one expected to smile and bow as you stepped onto that stage. Start with the math. The odds weren't great. In many periods of European history, 1 in 5 women died from complications of childbirth. That number was even higher for women who gave birth many times, which of course most queens and royal mistresses were expected to do. You weren't trying to have just one child, you were expected to produce several, in case the first few didn't survive, and they often didn't. Each pregnancy came with its own risks: infection, hemorrhage, puerperal fever, retained placenta, breech births, stillbirths, multiple births, placenta previa which could cause massive internal bleeding before anyone even realised what was happening. And there were no epidurals, no antibiotics, no modern sanitation. The tools were crude: forceps, if you were lucky, herbs, if you were desperate, prayers, always. There were midwives and court physicians, but even the most skilled among them couldn't stop a uterus from tearing or a baby from turning the wrong way. And if you were the queen, everyone was watching, literally. Royal births were often attended by dozens of people: ladies-in-waiting, physicians, clergy, noble observers, sometimes even foreign ambassadors. Not because they wanted to help, because they wanted to verify that the child was real, that it came from your body, that it wasn't a swap, a substitution, a scandal. So there you were, screaming, sweating, bleeding into sheets embroidered with your family's crest, while a crowd of mostly silent, uncomfortable onlookers judged your every movement. In France, royal births were public events. The Queen's chamber would be open to selected guests once labour began. The curtains drawn back, the windows uncovered, and if you asked for privacy, too bad, it was your duty to suffer where everyone could see it. Then there was the fear that something would go wrong, and that no one would tell you. Royal women weren't often given the full truth about their condition. They were reassured, pacified, told to pray. But behind closed doors, the doctors were panicking. One misstep, one bad turn, and everything could spiral. In the court of Charles II, a noblewoman died in childbirth after the court physician, terrified of being blamed, waited too long to call for a surgeon. Her husband was devastated. The king? He shrugged and suggested a new match. And if you did die, it didn't end there. Your death was dissected, politicised, sometimes even spun as divine punishment or cosmic judgment. Maybe you hadn't been pious enough. Maybe you had displeased your husband. Maybe the child was illegitimate and God struck you down. Even in death, your womb was everyone's business. Let's not forget the child either. If the baby lived, but you did not, your memory would be immortalised in portraits holding an infant you never got to meet. If the baby died and you survived, you were considered unlucky at best, cursed at worst. A royal woman who couldn't produce a living heir was barely considered a person at all. You were a failed promise, a waste of lineage. One queen, Maria Louisa of Savoy, suffered 10 pregnancies. She died in her early 20s. Only one child survived infancy, and there's a grim fringe tradition that many queens followed, writing out their wills before labour began. Not just because they feared the worst, but because they expected it. These wills often included elaborate funeral instructions, messages to children they might never see, and requests to be buried in convents, not cathedrals, because after so much public suffering, many royal women longed for privacy in death, if nowhere else. And the scholarly debate here, it centres on whether royal women had better care or worse outcomes than commoners. On one hand, they had access to the best physicians, the most experienced midwives, the cleanest chambers. On the other hand, they were forced to undergo more frequent births, more invasive observation, and more ceremonial intrusion. And when things went wrong, their caregivers were less willing to take risks, because no one wanted to be the doctor who killed the queen. Mistresses didn't fare much better. If a royal mistress became pregnant, her care depended entirely on the king's favour. If he still loved her, she might be surrounded by support. If he'd lost interest, She could be hidden away, delivered into the hands of second-rate midwives with no formal protection, and if she died, a quiet burial, a closed door, maybe a few words whispered by a chambermaid. It's no wonder that some royal women, those bold enough to defy expectation, tried to avoid pregnancy entirely. They took herbal contraceptives, practiced withdrawal, faked illnesses, anything to delay that next terrifying journey to the edge of mortality. But even that was risky, because the moment you said no to sex, or refused to try for another heir, you weren't just selfish, you were dangerous, a disruption in the royal plan. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, warm and safe and unobserved, think of the women who didn't have that luxury, who risked their lives every time they dared to hope, who bled on gold-threaded sheets under watchful eyes, who laboured not just for love or family, but for the weight of entire empires, and who far too often paid the highest price for a crown they never truly got to wear. The bells have stopped ringing. The court is asleep, or pretending to be. You sit alone in your private chapel, candlelight flickering against the stone walls, eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar. You can still feel the warmth of his hands on your body, the weight of duty pressing on your chest like an iron corset. The king has left your chambers. The palace, ever hungry for gossip, already knows. And now comes the part no one talks about. What happens after? After the desire, after the pressure, after the performance. You kneel, whispering the same words you've been taught since childhood, but tonight they feel different. You're not praying for favour, you're praying for forgiveness. Let's talk about sex and the confessor, the awkward, often guilt-laced relationship between royal women and their religious advisors. Because while queens and mistresses were expected to be seductive, fertile and compliant, they were also expected to be holy. And navigating the tightrope between flesh and faith required a spiritual balancing act that few ever managed without falling. Start with the basics. In most Catholic and Orthodox courts, confession was mandatory, not optional, not occasional, a routine part of life, especially for queens. You were expected to confess your sins regularly, often weekly, to an appointed priest who served not just as your spiritual guide, but also as a kind of moral accountant. He kept track of your soul's debt, so to speak, and made sure you were maintaining the proper image of piety, even if your nights told a different story. For mistresses, it was more complicated. Some were allowed confessors, others were denied them outright on the grounds that their role in court was inherently sinful. Still, many sought spiritual guidance in secret. They would summon sympathetic priests or travel discreetly to chapels outside the palace, hoping to unburden themselves without judgment. But judgment always found a way in. After all, they were confessing not only lust and immodesty, but also pride, manipulation, envy, and in some cases, having knowingly slept with a married man, even if that man was the king. And what were they told in return? Sometimes comfort, but more often penance, flagellation, fasting, long hours of prayer. One royal mistress in Spain was instructed to sleep on the stone floor once a week as an act of purification. Another was told to wear an iron rosary beneath her gown, the metal links digging into her skin to remind her that pleasure came at a price. Guilt was a currency, and it was paid in blood, hunger, and isolation. For queens, the pressure was doubled. They had to be both sexually available to their husbands and spiritually exemplary to the court, which meant confessing things they were never quite sure were sins. Was it a sin to find the king's touch repulsive? Was it a sin to pray for his visits to stop? Was it a sin to imagine another life, one where she wasn't examined or judged or reduced to her ability to produce heirs? Some confessors were gentle, others were less so. A French queen once reported that her priest scolded her for enjoying sex with her husband too enthusiastically. He said it showed a lack of spiritual discipline. She left the chapel crying, unsure whether she had offended God, her priest, or just her country's warped sense of morality. Then there were the rumours. Confession wasn't always confidential in the palace. A priest could become a spy. A rival faction might bribe him for details. What if you confessed to loving someone else, to lying about a pregnancy, to wishing your child had never been born? In a world where women were punished for less, those whispered admissions could be fatal. Some queens took to writing their sins in coded letters and burning them afterward, believing God would understand. Whether he did, or whether the palace cared, is another question entirely. And let's not pretend the priests were always neutral. Some used confession as leverage. They demanded obedience, threatened exposure, or pressured royal women into political action. One notorious Spanish confessor was known to advise his queen on everything from court appointments to when she should sleep with the king, couching it all within religious language. God commands it, he'd say. Your soul depends on it. It was spiritual blackmail wrapped in velvet. Even when women sought comfort in faith, the system was rigged against them. Sex, in their world, was rarely joyful. It was duty. It was performance. And afterward, it was guilt. Always guilt. Confessors told them to suppress desire, to view pleasure as weakness, to offer their bodies with humility, never passion. But the palace wanted results. Pregnancies, heirs, affection delivered from women too ashamed to even admit they wanted to be touched. The contradiction was unbearable. Be desirable, but not desirous. Be obedient, but not empty. Be holy, but still give him what he wants. If you failed, the fault was yours. If you succeeded, you were still expected to repent. Here's a strange little fringe fact. In some courts, confession was required before the king could visit his wife's bed. A clean soul for a dirty deed. In theory, it sanctified the act. In practice, it meant that both participants walked into the bedroom weighed down by the knowledge that what they were about to do needed divine permission, or forgiveness. Some women rebelled quietly, they stopped confessing altogether, or they began visiting mystics, nuns, or old women from the countryside who offered spiritual comfort without condemnation. Others doubled down, confessing obsessively, hoping that if they just fasted one more day, just whispered one more prayer, they might finally feel clean. The scholarly debate on this is sharp. Some argue that confession was a form of control, a way to keep royal women docile. Others say it provided rare moments of honesty in lives built on performance. Maybe it was both. Maybe confession was both a prison and a release. One more contradiction in a life where everything was either sacred or scandalous, with no room in between. So as you turn out your light tonight, remember the women who whispered into the dark, not to lovers but to God, who begged for forgiveness for things they never chose, who knelt before altars trying to make sense of a world that wanted them pure, desirable and silent, all at once, because in the palaces of old salvation wasn't free. It had a dress code, a schedule, and a velvet kneeler stained with too many tears. The ballroom is packed tonight. Fans flustering, pearls glittering, music swirling like honey through candlelit air. But no one's dancing just yet. Not really. They are watching, waiting, measuring glances and proximity like tacticians on a battlefield. You've come dressed grievily, your mask just crooked enough for to be intriguing, your lips painted in the shade the king once said he liked. But tonight isn't just another palace celebration. It's a masquerade, and here, with anonymity guaranteed and roles turned inside out, anything can happen. Welcome to the hidden world of royal masquerades, cross-dressing and erotic play, where the court forgot its rules for one wild night, and sometimes one wild night was all it took to upend everything. Masquerade balls in royal courts weren't just fancy dress parties. They were socially sanctioned chaos. For a few hours, everyone was allowed, expected even, to be someone else. A maid could be a queen. A nobleman might show up as a shepherd. Genders blurred, hierarchies crumbled, and people said things under masks they'd never dare say in daylight. The masks were more than decoration. They were license. And once the first wine-soaked giggle echoed through the hall, all bets were off. Let's start with the fashion. Cross-dressing was not only common, it was a key part of the spectacle. Men arrived in gowns with padded hips and lace gloves. Women donned breeches and powdered wigs, strutting with mock confidence and flirtatious swagger. It was play, yes, but also performance, testing limits, suggesting freedoms that didn't exist during daylight hours. And the palace didn't just allow it, it celebrated it. Because these events served a purpose, they were a safety valve, a way for the tightly coiled society of royal life to exhale, briefly and dramatically. Of course, these balls weren't without politics. Every costume was loaded with meaning. If you arrived dressed as a nun, was it mockery? If you wore a shepherd's outfit, were you pretending to be simple, or mocking someone else for being so? And if you dressed as the opposite sex, you could be seen as witty, daring, or scandalous, depending on who was watching and what secrets were already whispered about you. One of the most famous cross-dressing queens in history was Christina of Sweden, who we've already met. She wore men's clothes even outside of balls, and often blurred gender roles on purpose. But even more conventional monarchs indulged in costume play. Louis XIV once attended a masquerade as Apollo, sun god, golden half-naked, while his courtiers danced around him in mythic drag. Later, Louis XV's parties at Versailles became notorious for their theatrical flair. Men arrived in feathers and rouge, women borrowed military uniforms. At one ball, a duchess came dressed as her own footman and managed to flirt with 3 ambassadors before anyone realised who she was. The appeal was obvious. In a court where every move was watched, masked balls offered a moment of fantasy. You could flirt without consequence. You could speak plainly, hint boldly, step closer than was ever allowed in daylight. And yes, many affairs, both forbidden and expected, began or were consummated after masquerade nights. Mistresses used them to lure kings back into favour. Queens used them to remind the court of their allure. Some people just used them to escape the unbearable dullness of their daily identity. But the danger? Also real, because when you remove identity, you invite risk. One English prince was caught kissing a foreign nobleman at a masked event. The nobleman thought he was flirting with a duchess. The scandal was covered up, but not forgotten. In another court, a young woman dressed as a male soldier reportedly danced with her own brother, neither knowing the other's true identity. The horror, when revealed, led to months of public gossip and private embarrassment. And sometimes these nights turned violent. Duels were fought the morning after, sparked by perceived insults made under the protection of disguise. Affairs were discovered, loyalties exposed. There were even whispered rumours of assassinations attempted at masquerades, because what better place to stab someone than in a room full of people pretending to be someone else? Still, the masquerade thrived because it gave royal women, queens and mistresses alike, rare moments of control. If you wore the mask well, you could reverse your role entirely. Tonight you weren't a queen being watched. You were the watcher. You weren't a mistress under scrutiny. You were a hunter in silk, choosing your prey. And for women who spent most of their lives performing obedience, the chance to perform something else, even for one evening, was intoxicating. Here's a delicious fringe detail. Some royal masquerades ended with what were essentially orgies, although no one called them that. The polite term was private gathering. After the music ended, select guests were invited to continue the festivities elsewhere, usually in one of the lesser-used wings of the palace. What happened there was never written down officially, but memoirs and letters hint at wild indulgences. Clothes removed in laughter, games that had started with dice and ended with nudity, bodies slipping in and out of candlelight. For a few hours the hierarchy dissolved completely. And what about the morning after? Most people resumed their roles as if nothing had happened. Masks were returned to velvet-lined boxes, dresses refolded, wigs powdered into silence. But sometimes the consequences lingered. A sudden pregnancy, a new alliance, a jealousy awakened. One queen discovered her husband had spent the entire night with her most hated rival, both wearing masks, thinking that they'd gone unnoticed. She didn't confront him. She didn't have to. The next week, the rival's cousin lost a valuable court position, and a new mistress appeared on the horizon. Historians debate how seriously to take these events. Were they harmless fun, or ritualised rebellion? Some say they were pressure releases for a society stretched too tightly. Others argue they were subtle ways of testing power, gender and identity in a world where all three were normally fixed. Either way, they reveal something the official records never could. Even within the most rigid systems, people crave play. So tonight, as you pull up your own covers, no mask required, think about the queens who traded crowns for trousers, the dukes who danced in corsets, the palace full of people who just wanted one night to be someone else. And remember, behind every mask is a truth that couldn't be spoken in daylight, but found its voice beneath the chandeliers. The palace is quiet, but not peaceful. Tension hangs in the air like the scent of old roses left too long in a vase. You walk slowly down the corridor toward the Queen's apartments, past tapestries that once felt like scenery and now feel like witnesses. You're the King's mistress, or perhaps the former favourite depending on who's whispering, and the Queen knows it. She has always known. But now it's different. There's no pretense anymore. The smiles are sharper, the silence is longer. You can feel the chill in the air before you even enter the room. Welcome to the royal cage match, the rivalry between queens and mistresses. In royal courts, queens and mistresses existed in a strange toxic balance. They needed each other. They despised each other, and they were often trapped together in a game neither one chose to play. One held the title, the other held the king, one had the crown, the other had the passion, and no matter how they tried to pretend civility, everyone knew that behind the fans and folded hands, these two women were enemies, sometimes quietly, sometimes spectacularly. Sometimes it was just Cold War, icy glances across banquet tables, carefully timed arrivals at court events, compliments dipped in venom. The queen might send a gift to the mistress, a necklace, a gown, something too exquisite to be rejected but chosen with just enough irony to sting. In return, the mistress might call the queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting by the wrong name, again and again, until everyone noticed. It was all theatre, subtle, brutal, and completely exhausting, but other times the conflict turned openly vicious. There's the famous case of Madame de Montespan and Queen Marie-Thérèse of France. Montespan was the mistress of Louis XIV, and she was powerful, witty, and stunning. The queen, though more reserved, had the crown and a heart full of quiet fury. When Montespan began accompanying the king to official functions, the queen retaliated by refusing to share a chapel with her. This wasn't just religious pouting, it was a calculated social insult. Montespan in turn ensured the queen was left out of certain conversations. Guests were accidentally misdirected. Information was withheld. It was war, wrapped in silk and scripture. And in England, Barbara Villiers, mistress to Charles II, famously tried to humiliate Queen Catherine of Braganza by flaunting her status at court. She even forced her way into the Queen's private chapel, once interrupting a service by making a scene over where she was seated. The Queen said nothing, but within the month, 2 of Barbara's relatives lost their court appointments. In this world, no insult went unanswered. It just sometimes took a little time. Poison was not off the table either. Whispered rumours ran wild about queens slipping toxic tinctures into rival mistresses' tea, or mistresses paying servants to lace perfumes or cosmetics with slow-acting venoms. Were all of these stories true? Probably not. But the fear was, the paranoia was real. There were mistresses who kept personal food tasters, and queens who wore gloves at all times in court, just in case an accidental brush of hands turned deadly. One of the most dramatic confrontations came from Russia, where Empress Elizabeth had a series of very public meltdowns over her consort's mistresses. She once ordered one rival to be stripped of her jewellery mid-ball in front of a horrified crowd. In another case, a mistress was dragged from her carriage and beaten by palace guards at Elizabeth's instruction. The message was clear: flirt with the emperor if you like, but don't forget who holds the real power. But here's the thing, queens couldn't always win. Their power, though mighty, was often ceremonial. Mistresses, especially official ones, could access the king in moments of vulnerability. They knew his moods, his secrets, his fears. A well-timed whisper in bed could undo months of diplomatic work or shift the tide of court alliances. Some queens accepted this with icy dignity, others unravelled under the strain. And it wasn't just personal, these rivalries shaped policy. Court factions often divided themselves along team queen or team mistress lines. Ministers, nobles, even clergy aligned themselves with whichever woman they believed had the king's ear. Political appointments were granted or denied based on who was currently winning the silent war in the royal bedchamber. There's a fringe detail here that's almost laughable. Some queens were advised to become friends with the mistress. Truly, in certain circles it was thought more dignified and more strategic for a queen to accept her husband's infidelity and embrace the mistress as a companion. This rarely worked. Usually the friendship was forced, awkward, and short-lived. But on occasion, it led to eerie domestic arrangements where the queen, the king, and the mistress dined together, as if they weren't living in a twisted love triangle set against gold-panelled walls. And what about the king? Oh, he mostly floated above the drama, acting as though none of it involved him. He would console the queen with jewellery and flowers, then spend the night with the mistress. When tensions grew unbearable, he might send one of them away for a health retreat or spiritual reflection. This was code for exile, temporary or otherwise. Because when the women snapped, it wasn't the king who suffered, it was the one who broke composure first. Historians still argue about how much these rivalries truly impacted royal policy. Some say they were mostly symbolic, more gossip than governance. Others insist they were pivotal, that the queen versus Mistress dynamics shaped everything from foreign alliances to military funding. Either way, one thing's clear. The emotional toll was immense. Mistresses lived in fear of being replaced. Queens lived in bitterness, forced to share their husbands and smile through clenched teeth. Both were pawns, but both learned to play. Some wielded that pain like a dagger, others let it rot them from the inside, and every courtier watched with bated breath, because when two royal women clashed, the fallout could crack the kingdom's foundation. So tonight, if you're ever tempted to envy a woman with a crown or a lover in high places, remember what came with it. Betrayal disguised as protocol, hatred in embroidered gowns, and the constant knowledge that your greatest rival could be sipping tea across the room, smiling at your destruction. In the palace, love wasn't a triangle, it was a chessboard. It's raining outside, not a dramatic storm, just that persistent grey drizzle that makes the palace feel smaller, colder, like the walls have shrunk in overnight. You sit near the fire in your chambers, hands folded over a letter that hasn't been opened yet. The wax seal bears a familiar crest. It's from your father, or maybe your sister, or that cousin you haven't seen since you left your home country years ago. You hesitate before breaking the seal because you already know what's inside. Instructions, reminders, warnings cloaked in polite phrases. As if you needed another reminder that even now, years into your royal role, you're still not yours. You belong to them, to home, to duty, because palace life wasn't just about seduction and survival, it was also about espionage. Let's pull back the curtain on something most court dramas skip. Queens and mistresses were often quite literally spies, not fictional, not poetic, actual intelligence operatives, knowingly or unknowingly, transmitting information from the heart of one court to another. Because when the king takes you into his confidence, he doesn't just give you affection, he gives you access. And in the world of dynastic politics, access was power. Start with the queens. Most of them came from foreign lands, Spain, Austria, Poland, Italy. They were imports, often teenagers, sent into unfamiliar courts with the hope that they'd secure an alliance. But they weren't just there to look pretty and have babies. Their families expected reports, updates, information about troop movements, trade plans, treaties being drafted in smoky salons. And who had a better chance of hearing those secrets than the woman sharing the king's pillow? So they wrote letters, always coded, sometimes with lemon juice, sometimes with invisible ink, made from milk or vinegar, sent in the hems of dresses, hidden inside religious books, smuggled by trusted attendants. The Queen's embroidery kit might hold more than thread and silk. It might contain messages that could shift entire wars. And if she was caught, she could be accused of treason. And yet, they kept writing. One Spanish queen in the 16th century reportedly kept a private cipher key hidden beneath a floor tile in her dressing room. Another used her confessor as a courier, slipping tiny scrolls into the seams of his robes. Meanwhile, palace guards watched her letters go out and assumed they contained nothing but tedious family updates. She smiled, she curtsied, and she sent secrets back to Madrid every week. Mistresses, on the other hand, operated more like double agents. Some were recruited by foreign powers specifically because of their influence. Take the infamous Barbara Palmer, mistress to Charles II. Her letters to the French ambassador are practically love notes to Louis XIV, filled with details about English court politics. She was richly rewarded for her loyalty, even as she lived openly with the English king. Who was using whom? It's hard to say. Then there's the strange case of Countess Cosset, mistress to Augustus the Strong of Saxony. She started as a royal favourite and quickly became the central figure in an unofficial intelligence ring, passing secrets to Prussia in exchange for bribes, promises, and possibly just the thrill of it. When she was finally discovered, she wasn't executed. Too messy, too public. Instead, she was locked in a fortress for 49 years. Her crime? Knowing too much for too long. Espionage wasn't always deliberate. Sometimes it crept in quietly. A royal mistress might be flattered into conversation by a handsome ambassador, lured into a salon full of wine and flattery, and suddenly, without realising, she's revealing that the king is planning a tax increase or that the navy's been ordered south. Just dinner talk. Just pillow talk. Except that it wasn't. It was currency. And it wasn't just politics, fashion trends, dietary habits, court scandals, all of these were valuable intelligence. A letter describing the king's favourite food might seem innocent until you realise it could be used to poison him. A note about a queen's late-night meeting with a certain minister could unravel an entire faction. In this world, gossip and warfare blurred until they were almost the same thing. Here's a fringe little detail. Some royal women were trained in spycraft before they arrived at court. Secret schools, yes, actual schools, existed to teach noble girls the art of code-breaking, silent observation and rhetorical manipulation. In Italy, one monastery reportedly served as a covert training centre for future queens and noble wives, preparing them for both marriage and espionage. The curriculum? Latin, theology, and lying with grace. Historians have long debated the ethics of it. Were these women complicit or coerced? Were they agents of power or simply caught in the current? Some scholars argue that they were exploited by their families, used like pawns. Others see them as quietly subversive, wielding their roles like daggers in velvet sheaths. Either way, their impact was undeniable. And the king? Sometimes he knew, sometimes he let it happen. A few monarchs even used their queens and mistresses as unofficial liaisons, conduits for messages too delicate to send through traditional channels. It was deniable, clean, and occasionally brilliant. Who would suspect that the woman trailing her fingers over a fan at the masquerade ball was quietly negotiating an arms deal? But there was always risk. The moment you were suspected, even suspected of being a spy, everything changed. Your apartments might be searched, your letters intercepted, your friends interrogated. One Austrian princess was stripped of her titles and confined to a remote convent after her brother-in-law accused her of sharing military secrets. Whether she actually did, no one knows, but her cell faced north with no view at all. And so, royal women became masters of performance, not just in bed or at court, but in every word they spoke, every glance, every sigh. The queen might speak softly of poetry while memorising the seating arrangement at a diplomatic dinner. The mistress might flutter her eyelashes at a nobleman, only to relay everything he said to a rival faction the next morning. Because in the palace, power wasn't always about who ruled. Sometimes it was about who listened, who remembered, who knew how to take the quiet moments, the kiss, the gift, the whisper, and turn them into leverage. So tonight, as you rest in your own life of relative anonymity, think of the women who lived behind embroidered veils, who stitched secrets into handkerchiefs and learned how to nod without agreeing. Queens who played dumb, mistresses who played clever, all of them walking the finest line between affection and betrayal, knowing that even the softest confession might become a weapon. Because in the palace, love wasn't the only thing being exchanged in the dark. It begins with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows after laughter has stopped, after doors have closed, after your name is no longer whispered with curiosity, but avoided entirely. You were the favourite once, his favourite. The jewel of the court, the one whose presence made heads turn, whose smile could start rumours, or end them. But now, the light has shifted. The king no longer lingers, the gifts have slowed. The courtiers you used to mock behind fans no longer bow so deeply. Welcome to the slow death of relevance in the palace, the inevitable merciless decline of a queen who's failed to deliver, or a mistress who's been replaced. Every royal woman, every single one, knew this moment was coming. Maybe not when, maybe not how, but it was always there, waiting in the wings like a patient executioner. And it didn't take bloodshed. No, this kind of fall was quieter, more intimate. A look that lingers too long on someone else, a letter delayed, a birthday unacknowledged. Your silk gowns still shine, but your place in the king's heart has dulled. You're no longer new, you are no longer needed. Queens were protected by title, but that title was often a cage. If a queen failed to produce an heir, especially at a male one, her status began to rot from within. The court never said it outright, but they said it with looks, with absences, with sudden coldness from former allies. Your role was to give life, to continue the line. If your womb failed, your worth was re-evaluated, no matter how pious, diplomatic or kind you'd been. One Habsburg queen wrote in her journal, "I am not a woman, I am a vessel, and when the vessel is empty, it is cast aside." Chilling and true, mistresses suffered a different fate. Disposability. They rose fast, burned bright, and then, poof. The king's eye wandered, sometimes to someone younger, sometimes to someone smarter, sometimes just to someone else. And unlike queens, mistresses had no crown to fall back on. When you were out, you were out. The apartments were reassigned, the jewels returned. The courtiers who once called you Madame forgot your name within a week. You went from conversation to cautionary tale in the time it took to pack your hairbrush. One particularly brutal example is the downfall of Madame du Barry. She was adored by Louis XV, given staggering wealth and power. But after the king's death, she was banished from court, publicly shamed. During the Revolution she was arrested and executed, not just for her wealth, but for the sin of having once held power without being born to it. Her beauty didn't save her, her charm didn't save her. In the end, she was just another former mistress with enemies. Sometimes queens and mistresses were replaced by the same woman, a court favourite who charmed her way into the king's bed and then slipped into his wife's seat at the banquet. When this happened, the dethroned women rarely made scenes. They couldn't. They were watched too closely. Instead, they withdrew, first from parties, then from promenades, then from politics. One English queen took to embroidery, stitching hundreds of delicate roses into silk handkerchiefs while the new mistress paraded through her garden. Another retreated to a convent, not for God, for escape. The emotional toll was immense. Some women aged rapidly, consumed by bitterness and grief. Others played the long game, waiting years for their rival to fall from grace. And a few tried to return to favour, reinventing themselves with new fashions, new causes, even new lovers. But it rarely worked. The palace wasn't interested in comebacks. It wanted novelty. Let's not forget, ageing was a crime in royal courts. Not officially, of course, but silently, cruelly. Wrinkles were hidden behind veils. Grey hair was dyed or plucked or covered entirely. If you were no longer young, you had to appear young. And if you couldn't do that, you became invisible, no longer spoken of, unless it was to mock your decline. A woman who had once been the very pulse of court life reduced to a tired name in an old song. There's a fringe tradition that captures this perfectly. In the Polish-Lithuanian court, when a former mistress was formally dismissed, she was given a farewell dinner, complete with music, wine and a veiled toast to her former beauty. It was satire, kind on the surface but humiliating underneath. A final kiss of death in public, before exile in private. Historians debate whether these women had any lasting influence once they were pushed aside. Some say yes, that behind the scenes, they advised, wrote letters, even influenced key marriages. Others argue their power was fleeting by design, that the palace consumed them and moved on like fashion. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Some faded, some fought. Some won small, strange victories from the shadows. A few managed to survive with dignity. They retired to estates, took lovers of their own, wrote memoirs filled with half-truths and elegant insults. Others became cautionary figures, reminders to every ambitious girl at court that beauty faded, favour was fickle, and even the king's most intimate companion could become a ghost in her own home. And so you sit by the fire, watching the flames dance over the gold embroidery of your robe, letter still unopened in your lap. You know the court is moving on. The whispers have shifted to a new name, a new dress, a new fragrance wafting down the hallways. You don't cry, not tonight, you've cried enough. Instead, you fold the letter neatly and place it in the drawer with the others. Your handwriting, your memories, your legacy, still yours, even if your place in the palace is not. Because the fall from grace is never fast. It's a slow, steady erosion, a peeling away of importance, a gentle but relentless reminder that in this world you are only valuable for as long as they desire you. And when they stop, you disappear. The palace doesn't notice your absence. Not really. The chandeliers still flicker. The carriages still roll through the gates. The court continues to dance, to flatter, seduce, betray, just as it always has. Somewhere a new queen has just been crowned. A mistress has caught the king's eye. A maid is crying softly into her apron, because she understands now, too late, what it costs to be loved in this place. But you've stepped back, faded just enough into the edges to be ignored. You watch it all from the safety of obscurity and ask yourself a question you never had the luxury to consider before. Was it worth it? You remember the pressure, the whispered hopes of a child, the clink of jewellery promised if you just gave him what he needed, the midwives checking your stomach as if inspecting a melon at market, the way a missed period could launch a week of surveillance, the shame of blood on the wrong day, the terrible hope that he would come to your chambers, and the worse fear that he wouldn't. You remember the masquerades, the thrill of anonymity, the fleeting joy of pretending you weren't just a royal asset with a womb and a title. You danced with ministers you hated and kissed men you barely knew. You drank wine until the chandelier blurred and tried, just once, to imagine that this life was yours by choice. You remember the queen, or maybe you were the queen remembering the mistress. Either way, you remember the other woman, the way her perfume lingered in hallways, the laughter that echoed through walls too thin, the constant humiliation of her presence, sometimes subtle, sometimes crushing. You hated her, you pitied her, you saw yourself in her. You remember the child you lost, the one no one talks about anymore. Maybe the king didn't even notice. Maybe he sent you a vase of lilies and never asked again. But you remember. You remember the way the world kept turning as you bled and cried and pretended to recover. You remember the emptiness, the silence after the midwife left, the weight of what could have been. You remember the confessions, kneeling before a man more interested in your soul's paperwork than your pain, whispering sins that didn't feel sinful, being told to fast, to suffer, to pray harder. You remember asking God for forgiveness, not because you'd done wrong, but because you didn't know who else to ask. And you remember when it ended, the last time the king looked at you and didn't see you, when the letters stopped arriving, when the glances turned to gossip. You remember pretending not to care. You remember caring too much. You remember the long walk from your apartments to smaller rooms, where the curtains were dull and the air too still. You remember folding the last of your gowns into chests you knew would never be opened again. But you also remember your own defiance, the secrets you kept, the alliances you forged, the small victories, petty, perhaps, but yours. You remember the day you stopped waiting for his summons, the moment you realised that even if the palace forgot you, you would not forget yourself. Historians will never know everything. They'll write about the politics, the pacts, the pregnancies. They'll debate your role, your influence, your guilt, but they won't know what it felt like. To lie beneath a man who called you my treasure in public and nothing at all in private. To carry his child and his secrets and never be thanked for either. To stand beside him, radiant in ceremony, and be invisible where it mattered. Because royal sex was never just about pleasure. It was a transaction, a negotiation, a game with no rules and too many players. And for women, queens and mistresses alike, it was a battlefield lined with silks and scented with rosewater. The wounds were invisible, the scars permanent. Now, as you light a candle for no one but yourself, the palace far behind you, you smile, not bitterly, not triumphantly, just a quiet, knowing smile. You survived. You navigated the labyrinth. You bore the weight of expectation and shame and still found a way to remain you, however small, however quiet. So tonight, as we dim the lights and let history exhale its final breath, remember them. The queens who were never queens in their own homes. The mistresses who gave everything for a seat beside power, only to find themselves alone. The women whose bodies were battlegrounds, whose desires were irrelevant, and whose names were footnotes in the story of kings. But most of all, remember, behind every portrait in gold, behind every whispered scandal, behind every royal bedpost carved with lions and lilies, there was a woman, breathing, enduring, wanting something more. The story's over now, the candles are out, the halls of the palace echo only with memory, like footsteps long faded into stone. You're still here, tucked beneath your own quiet sheets, listening to the hum of your own time, your own place. A place without servants standing at the door while you dress, without titles handed out like shackles, without every moment of your body catalogued, judged, and reinterpreted as a symbol of something else. And maybe you're still thinking about them. The queens who lay in gold-trimmed beds trying to feel human. The mistresses who outmaneuvered kings and still ended up forgotten. Their stories aren't just romantic tragedies. They're warnings, they're maps, they're reflections of how power uses beauty, how systems use desire, and how women, again and again, are asked to surrender themselves in exchange for the illusion of permanence. But even in the worst moments, bleeding alone after childbirth, kneeling before a confessor who couldn't understand, smiling while being replaced, these women carved something out of nothing. They resisted in whispers, in glances, in secrets, and sometimes they even won. Not by changing the system, not always, but by remembering who they were before the crown, before the pearls, before the palace decided their value. So if you're still awake, let that be your final thought tonight. The quiet, unglamorous resilience of women who knew that seduction wasn't about pleasure, it was survival. Who knew that intimacy wasn't always romantic, it was often political. Who knew that even the softest rebellion can echo through history like the rustle of silk in a throne room? Dim the lights a little more, let the hush settle in. You've travelled far tonight, from masked balls to birthing rooms to confessionals and corridors lined with fear and velvet. You've seen the power of a well-placed glance. You've felt the weight of a king's disinterest. And now you can rest. Thank you for staying, for listening, for remembering them.